Winter owns the northern cliffs the way death owns a battlefield. No negotiation, no mercy, just absolute dominion. Duke Vaelor Draven rules Blackthorne Keep with that same brutal certainty, and tonight you're going to witness exactly what happens when a man built from violence meets a woman who refuses to break. This isn't some fairy tale about redemption. This is about survival at the edge of a knife. Stick around until the end, because what you think you know about power is about to get shattered. Drop a like if you're ready for something that doesn't pull punches, and comment what city you're watching from, because this story belongs to everyone who's ever had to choose between bending or burning. The obsidian walls of Blackthorne Keep rose against the winter sky like teeth waiting to close. Seraphine Vael watched them grow larger through the frost-covered window of the carriage, each passing mile driving iron spikes deeper into her chest. The road wound through valleys where snow had buried everything that once lived, where skeletal trees clawed at clouds heavy with the promise of more cold, more death, more nothing. Her father hadn't even looked at her when he signed the contract. Lord Matthias Vael, a man who'd once commanded respect across 3 territories, had gambled away their family's future on cards and wine and the arrogant belief that luck would eventually turn in his favor. It never did. By the time the collectors came, the only asset House Vael possessed that anyone wanted was sitting across from her now in this freezing carriage, wrapped in furs that couldn't touch the cold settling in her bones. Her younger sister Ilara stared at her hands, 14 years old and already understanding that their bloodline would die with Seraphine's sacrifice. Their mother had been dead 5 years, taken by fever that ravaged the eastern provinces. Now their father might as well be dead too, drowning in debt and shame while his eldest daughter paid the price of his weakness. The carriage hit a rut in the frozen road. Seraphine's head struck the window frame hard enough to leave her vision swimming with black spots. Neither the driver nor the 2 armed guards riding alongside bothered to slow down. They'd been purchased along with everything else. Duke Vaelor Draven owned the horses, the carriage, the road, and the woman being delivered to his fortress like livestock to slaughter. The guards wore black steel armor marked with the Draven crest, a raven devouring a crown. Seraphine had learned the symbolism young. The message wasn't subtle. Blackthorne didn't serve the Empire. The Empire bent its neck before Blackthorne and hoped the blade stayed clean. She'd heard the stories since childhood. Everyone had. Duke Vaelor Draven, the ruthless Duke, the Iron Wolf, the man who'd ordered an entire noble family executed before sunrise for attempting to poison his wine. 23 people, men, women, children. He'd made the other nobles watch, made them understand that betrayal wasn't a crime that died with the guilty. It was a disease that required complete eradication. The youngest victim had been 6 years old. Some claimed he'd shown mercy by making the deaths quick. Others whispered that Mercy had died in Vaelor Draven the same night his father was assassinated during a peace summit, leaving a 17-year-old heir to inherit a crumbling alliance and enemies circling like wolves around fresh blood. The boy who'd knelt beside his father's corpse had stood up a different creature entirely. Within 6 months, every conspirator had been found and flayed alive in the central courtyard of Blackthorne. Within a year, the northern territories had learned that the Draven bloodline couldn't be broken. It could only break others. Seraphine pressed her palm against the cold glass, watching her breath fog the window. She'd prepared herself for this, spent weeks reading everything she could find about Blackthorne Keep and its master, studied the marriages he'd contracted before, though none had resulted in heirs. 2 of those wives had died, one from illness, one from falling from the eastern tower during a storm, though rumors suggested the fall hadn't been accidental. The 3rd wife had simply vanished. No body, no explanation, just an empty bedroom and a duke who'd never spoken her name again. The carriage began climbing. The road narrowed as cliffs rose on either side, channeling them toward the fortress that had stood for 300 years. Blackthorne Keep sprawled across the mountain peak like a crown of stone and iron, its walls built from black rock that seemed to devour light rather than reflect it. Towers jutted toward the gray sky. Battlements bristled with guards and ballistas. Everything about the structure screamed one message: attempt to take this place, and your bones will feed the crows for generations. Ilara finally broke the silence. Her voice came out small and cracked. What if he's as terrible as they say? Seraphine didn't look away from the approaching fortress. Seraphine didn't look away from. Then I'll survive him the way everyone else has, by being more useful alive than dead. That's not reassuring. It wasn't meant to be. The gates opened as they approached. Massive iron constructs that moved with mechanical precision, pulled by chains thicker than a man's torso. Guards lined the entrance, 50 men in perfect formation, faces hidden behind helmets that transformed them into identical instruments of violence. The message was clear. Blackthorne didn't rely on loyalty or honor. It relied on discipline and the absolute certainty that disobedience meant death. The carriage rolled into the main courtyard. Seraphine's first impression was scale. The space could have held 1,000 soldiers comfortably. The stones beneath the carriage wheels had been worn smooth by centuries of boots and hooves and blood. Braziers burned along the walls, throwing shadows that danced like demons across the obsidian stone. Snow fell in lazy spirals, melting before it touched ground, heated by forge fires somewhere deep beneath the fortress. Servants emerged from doorways, not rushing, not frightened, just moving with the efficient purpose of people who understood their roles too well to waste motion on anything else. A steward in dark robes approached the carriage, his face carrying the weathered neutrality of someone who'd watched 100 arrivals exactly like this one. "Lady Seraphine Vael," he said without inflection. Not a question, a confirmation. "I am Aldrich, Seneschal of Blackthorne Keep. The Duke requests your presence in the Great Hall within the hour. Your belongings will be transferred to the South Wing. Your sister will be housed in the guest quarters until appropriate arrangements can be made." Alara grabbed Seraphine's hand. "We're being separated?" Aldrich's expression didn't change. "Those are the Duke's orders." Seraphine squeezed her sister's fingers once, hard enough to hurt, then released them. "It's fine. Go with them. Don't cause problems." "But I said go." The sharpness in her voice did what gentleness couldn't. Alara climbed from the carriage, guided away by 2 female servants who moved like they'd performed this exact task 100 times before. Seraphine watched her sister disappear through an arched doorway, then turned back to Aldrich. "The Great Hall. 1 hour. The Duke values punctuality. I'm sure the Duke values many things. Punctuality probably ranks somewhere below absolute obedience and well above pretending his bride is here by choice." The faintest flicker of something, surprise maybe, crossed Aldrich's weathered face. Then it was gone, replaced by that same carved neutrality. "The South Wing, 3rd floor. Your chambers overlook the Eastern Valley. I'd advise against wandering. Blackthorne is larger than it appears, and some areas are restricted to those without proper authorization. Meaning I'm a prisoner. Meaning you're the Duke's betrothed. There's a difference." "Is there, Russ?" Aldrich turned and began walking toward a different entrance. Seraphine followed, boots crunching on stones that had absorbed so much history they probably bled memory when it rained. They entered a corridor wide enough to march an entire battalion through. Tapestries lined the walls depicting battles Seraphine didn't recognize. Men dying, castles burning, ravens feasting on corpses. Blackthorne's version of decoration apparently involved reminding everyone exactly what happened to enemies foolish enough to challenge Draven supremacy. They climbed a spiral staircase, then another. The fortress expanded around her like a labyrinth designed by someone who wanted visitors confused and frightened. Every corridor branched into 3 more. Every door looked identical. Guards stood at seemingly random intervals, silent and watchful, hands resting on sword hilts with the casual confidence of men who'd used those weapons recently and would again without hesitation. Aldrich finally stopped before a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands. He produced a key, unlocked it, and pushed it open. "Your chambers, Lady Vael. I'll return in 45 minutes to escort you to the Great Hall." The room beyond was larger than her entire bedroom back home. A massive 4-poster bed dominated the space, draped in black silk and furs. A fireplace tall enough to stand in roared with flames that threw dancing light across furniture that cost more than most families earned in a lifetime. Windows stretched from floor to ceiling along one wall, offering a view of mountains and valleys and emptiness that stretched to the edge of the world. Seraphine stepped inside. The door closed behind her with the finality of a coffin lid. She stood there for several minutes, just breathing, letting the reality of her situation settle into her bones. This was her life now. These walls, this fortress, this man she'd never met who owned everything, including her future. Her father had sold her to preserve a family name that wasn't worth preserving. House Vael had died the moment Matthias Vael chose cards over honor. What remained was just a daughter paying interest on debts she never owed. She walked to the windows. The view was stunning and terrible. Mountains clawed at storm clouds. Valleys disappeared into shadow. Far below, she could see the courtyard where her carriage had arrived, already being stripped and stored. Evidence of her arrival erased like it never happened. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Enter, or Wolpos. A young woman slipped through the door carrying an armful of clothing. Dark hair, efficient movements, eyes that assessed Seraphine with the quick calculation of someone trained to read people and adjust accordingly. I'm Mira. I'll be attending to you during your stay at Blackthorne. The Duke has requested you dress appropriately for the meeting. These garments have been prepared for your arrival. Seraphine watched as Mira laid out a gown across the bed. Black silk with silver embroidery that caught the firelight like trapped stars. Beautiful and expensive and designed to send a message. Brides wore white. Possessions wore the colors of their owners. The Duke has excellent taste in chains. Mira paused, fingers smoothing non-existent wrinkles from the fabric. The Duke has excellent taste in general, my lady. Those who remember that tend to last longer in Blackthorne than those who don't. Is that a warning or advice? Both. Seraphine studied the younger woman. Mira couldn't have been more than 20, but her eyes carried the hardness of someone who'd seen things that aged the soul faster than the body. How long have you served here? 7 years since I was 13. And you've survived that long by remembering the Duke has excellent taste. I've survived that long by understanding that Blackthorne Keep operates on rules older than kingdoms. Know the rules. Follow the rules. Pray you never become important enough that the rules don't matter anymore, because important people in this fortress tend to die in interesting ways. Sounds like a wonderful place to call home. Mira's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. Understanding, maybe, or pity. Hard to tell which. I'll help you dress, my lady. We have 30 minutes. The gown fit perfectly. Of course it did. Vaelor Draven struck Seraphine as the type of man who planned everything, controlled everything, measured everything down to the last detail. The dress hugged her curves without being obscene, displayed wealth without appearing desperate, and made her look like exactly what she was. Property dressed for presentation. Mira worked in silence, adjusting fabric and securing clasps with practiced efficiency. When she finished, Seraphine barely recognized herself in the mirror. The woman staring back looked like she belonged in this fortress of stone and violence. Dark hair arranged in intricate braids, pale skin against black silk, green eyes that reflected firelight like broken glass. She looked like someone who could survive Blackthorne. She hoped the reflection wasn't lying. Aldrich returned exactly 45 minutes after he'd left. Punctual, obedient. Probably terrified beneath that neutral mask because people who worked for men like Vaelor Draven learned early that mistakes weren't forgiven, they were buried. They descended through corridors that seemed designed to disorient, left, right, downstairs, through galleries hung with portraits of dead Dravens who stared with the same cold calculation their descendant had inherited. The fortress breathed around them, ancient and aware, like a living thing that had absorbed too much violence to ever be clean again. They reached a pair of doors 20 feet tall, carved with scenes of battle so detailed Seraphine could make out individual soldiers dying in individual ways. Aldrich knocked once. The sound echoed like thunder. Enter. The voice came from beyond the doors, deep, controlled, carrying an edge that suggested whoever spoke rarely repeated themselves because disobedience wasn't a concept that survived long in their presence. The doors swung open. The great hall stretched before her like a cathedral built to worship power instead of gods. Columns rose toward a vaulted ceiling lost in shadow. Braziers lined the walls, flames roaring against iron grates. The floor was polished black marble, veined with silver, reflecting the firelight in patterns that looked like lightning frozen in stone. At the far end, elevated on a platform of obsidian steps, sat a throne carved from a single piece of black granite. And standing before that throne, backlit by flames that turned him into something carved from shadow and violence, was Duke Vaelor Draven. He wasn't what she expected. The stories had painted him as a monster. They'd been wrong. Monsters were simple. Monsters could be understood. What stood before her was something colder and infinitely more dangerous. A man who'd weaponized discipline until it replaced humanity entirely. Vaelor Draven stood over 6 feet tall, built like someone who'd spent more time fighting than ruling. Dark hair cut short and practical, jaw sharp enough to cut, eyes that assessed her with the dispassionate precision of someone evaluating livestock at market. He wore black leather and steel, nothing ceremonial about it. Working armor for a working killer. One gloved hand rested on the pommel of a sword that looked like it had seen recent use. The blade clean, but the leather grip stained dark with substances Seraphine didn't want to consider too closely. She'd expected him to speak first, demand her obeisance, issue orders. Instead, he just watched her walk across that massive hall, each step echoing against stone that had witnessed centuries of submission. The silence stretched between them like a test she didn't understand how to pass. When she reached the platform steps, she stopped, didn't kneel, didn't lower her eyes, just met his gaze and waited. Several seconds passed. Then Vaelor moved, descending the steps with predatory grace. He circled her slowly, examining, calculating, reducing her to components and measurements and potential uses. When he finally stopped in front of her again, standing close enough that she could see the faint scars crossing his hands and the complete absence of warmth in his expression, he spoke. Your father is a coward and a fool. His debts could have purchased 3 estates. Instead, I'm receiving one woman who hasn't been trained for court politics and probably believes she can survive here through cleverness and determination. Seraphine kept her voice level. If you wanted someone trained for court politics, you should have purchased a different bride. I didn't want a bride. I wanted leverage over the eastern trade routes your father controlled before he gambled them away to Lord Cassian Mordrell. You were the most efficient way to prevent Mordrell from consolidating power in territories that border mine. How romantic. Romance is for people who have time to die slowly. In Blackthorne, we deal in transactions. I'm giving your family's name protection and resources. You're giving me legitimacy with the eastern noble houses and preventing a rival from gaining strategic advantage. It's efficient. And if I refuse, Vaelor's expression didn't change. Then your father's remaining debts become due immediately. House Vael collapses entirely. Your sister becomes a ward of the state, which means she'll be married off to whoever offers the highest bid or most strategic advantage. She's 14. Pretty enough that she'll attract interest from men who prefer their wives young and easily controlled. That's the practical outcome of refusal. The casual cruelty of it hit harder than any threat could have, because he wasn't trying to frighten her. He was just explaining reality with the same tone someone might use to describe weather patterns or crop rotations. This was how his world worked. Leverage, control. Outcomes calculated down to the individual victim. You're a bastard. Yes, I'm also the bastard who's keeping your family name alive and your sister out of considerably worse situations than this one. Perspective matters, Lady Vael. He turned away, moving back toward the throne with that same controlled efficiency. When he reached the platform, he didn't sit, just stood there, one hand still resting on his sword, watching her with eyes that had probably watched 100 people die and felt nothing beyond mild irritation at the cleanup required afterward. The wedding will take place in 3 days. You'll meet with Aldrich tomorrow to review expectations and protocols. You'll be introduced to the noble families who serve Blackthorne at a formal banquet 2 nights from now. At that banquet, you will smile. You will be gracious. You will demonstrate that House Vael has aligned itself with Draven interests and that this union represents strength rather than desperation. And if I can't manage that performance, then you'll learn very quickly that Blackthorne has limited tolerance for failure. My previous wives understood that lesson, some faster than others. The words hung in the air like smoke from an execution pyre. Seraphine felt ice slide down her spine, but she refused to look away, refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing fear. Your previous wives, the ones who died or disappeared, were those lessons or were those just eliminations of inconvenient problems? For the first time, something flickered across Vaelor's face. Not anger, not guilt. Something colder. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement that she'd just asked a question most people were too frightened to voice. They were failures, nothing more, nothing less. Sentiment doesn't serve purpose in environments like this. When someone stops being useful, they stop being protected. It's efficient. You keep using that word, efficient, like it justifies anything. It justifies survival, which is all that matters in territories where power shifts with every harvest and every alliance depends on who has the sharpest blade and the willingness to use it without hesitation. You want to judge me for being ruthless? Go ahead. But understand that every noble family within 200 miles of Blackthorne exists because I've been ruthless enough to keep them alive. The merchants trade safely because I've executed enough bandits that the roads stay clear. The harvests succeed because I've burned enough rebellious villages that the others remember cooperation brings prosperity, while defiance brings ashes. I'm not the villain of your father's gambling debts. I'm the reason civilization hasn't collapsed into tribal warfare across the entire northern territories. He descended the steps again, moving closer, forcing her to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. When he spoke next, his voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, but the intensity behind the words hit like physical blows. You think I'm a monster? That's fine. Most people do. But monsters are simple. Monsters just destroy. I build, I maintain. I protect what's mine with absolute commitment, because the alternative is watching everything burn while weaker men debate mercy and justice and fairness. Your father learned that lesson when his weakness destroyed everything your family built over generations. Now you're learning it by standing in my hall, wearing my colors, because your survival depends on understanding that in Blackthorne Keep, strength isn't a virtue. It's the only thing that keeps you breathing. Seraphine's hands curled into fists hidden in the silk of her gown. Everything in her wanted to scream, to fight, to reject this entire situation and the man who'd engineered it with cold calculation. But beneath the rage, beneath the fear, something else was growing, understanding, terrible, and complete. He was right, not morally right, not ethically right, but practically, functionally right. Her father's weakness had destroyed everything. Vaelor's strength had created an empire. The world didn't care about justice. It cared about who held the knife and who knew how to use it without flinching. She hated him for making her see it. What do you want from me? Vaelor stepped back, that cold assessment returning to his expression. Competence. Loyalty to Blackthorne above whatever sentiment you carry for your birth family. The ability to smile at people who'd murder you for political advantage, and the intelligence to identify them before they get close enough to try. And most importantly, the understanding that everything inside these walls belongs to me. Every servant, every guard, every noble who bends their knee in my hall, even the people who believe they still own themselves. The torches flickered. Somewhere deep in the fortress, metal scraped against stone. Outside, wolves howled across the mountains, their voices carrying through wind that smelled like snow and approaching storms. Seraphine straightened her spine, met his eyes, made her choice. Then I hope you're prepared to protect what you're claiming, because if I'm a possession, I'm one that comes with complications. Something almost like amusement flickered across Vaelor's face. Not warmth, but interest. Like she'd just proven herself slightly less boring than expected. I've never met a possession without complications. That's what makes them worth keeping. He turned away, dismissing her without another word. Aldrich appeared from somewhere in the shadows, materializing like he'd been waiting for this exact moment. The seneschal gestured toward the massive doors. Seraphine followed him back through corridors that felt more like tunnels now, leading her deeper into the labyrinth that was Blackthorne Keep. When they finally reached her chambers, Aldrich paused before leaving. You handled that better than most, Lady Vael. The Duke's second wife fainted during their first meeting. The third ran. Neither response ended well. What happened to them? The second died of fever 6 months after the wedding. The third disappeared from the eastern tower during a storm. Neither death was investigated particularly thoroughly. And the first wife? Aldrich's expression went carefully blank. The Duke doesn't speak about his first marriage. I'd advise against asking. He left before Seraphine could respond. She stood alone in chambers too large and too cold, staring out windows that showed nothing but darkness and distant mountains. Below, Blackthorne Keep stretched in all directions, a kingdom built from stone and violence, and the absolute certainty that power mattered more than anything else in this world. Somewhere in that fortress, Vaelor Draven was planning, calculating, reducing her to components in whatever strategy he'd built around eastern trade routes and rival nobles and consolidating power across territories that probably existed on maps she'd never seen. And somewhere in the guest quarters, Elara was probably crying, frightened, alone, trapped in a situation their father had created through weakness disguised as ambition. Seraphine pressed her forehead against the cold glass. 3 days until the wedding. 3 days until she became Lady Draven. 3 days until everything she'd been died and something else took its place. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt something colder settling into her bones. Not acceptance, not surrender, but recognition. The same recognition she'd seen in Vaelor's eyes when she'd refused to look away from him in that hall. He'd called her a possession. But possessions that came with complications tended to be the ones that lasted longest. She'd survived her father's collapse, survived the journey to Blackthorne, survived her first encounter with the ruthless Duke without breaking or running or fainting. Now she just had to survive everything that came next. The wolves howled again. Closer this time. Like they'd caught the scent of something dying and were circling, waiting for weakness to show itself so they could finish what the cold had started. Seraphine turned away from the window. Let them wait. She wasn't dying yet. The next morning arrived with bells echoing across the fortress, calling everyone to their various duties with mechanical precision. Seraphine woke to find Mira already in her chambers, laying out clothing and preparing breakfast with the efficient silence of someone who'd learned that unnecessary conversation was just another form of risk. The Duke has meetings in the war room until midday, Mira said, setting a tray on the table near the fireplace. Aldrich will collect you after that for your protocol review. Until then, you're free to explore the South Wing. Just the South Wing. Going beyond that without escort will result in guards returning you here with considerably less courtesy than you'd prefer. Seraphine sat up, every muscle protesting. She'd barely slept, too wired on adrenaline and the surreal horror of her situation to find any real rest. The war room. Is there a war? There's always a war. Sometimes it's with swords. Sometimes it's with contracts and marriages, and very polite assassination attempts during banquets. The Duke spends most mornings managing both kinds. Must be exhausting. Must be necessary. Mira moved toward the door. Eat. Dress. Try not to do anything that requires explaining to the Duke why his new bride has already become a problem. She left. Seraphine ate without tasting the food, her mind already spinning through possibilities. 3 days. She had 3 days to learn everything she could about Blackthorne, about the Duke, about the noble families who'd be watching her during the banquet. 3 days to transform from a desperate daughter, paying her father's debts, into something that could survive in this place where power was the only currency that mattered. She dressed in simpler clothing than the night before. Dark trousers, a fitted shirt, practical boots. If she was going to explore the South Wing, she'd do it comfortably, rather than wrapped in silk that restricted movement. The corridor outside her chambers was empty. Morning light streamed through windows that overlooked the fortress interior. She could see courtyards below where guards drilled in perfect formation, their movements synchronized like they were parts of a single machine designed for violence. Beyond that, smithies breathed smoke toward gray skies. Servants moved between buildings carrying supplies. Everything operated with ruthless efficiency. She walked. The South Wing revealed itself as a maze of interconnected galleries and chambers, libraries filled with books that probably held more military strategy than poetry, armories stocked with enough weapons to outfit a small army, training rooms where the walls were scarred from blade practice and the floors stained dark with blood from sparring sessions that apparently didn't stop at first blood. No one stopped her. Guards watched as she passed but didn't interfere. Servants nodded respectfully but maintained distance. She was the Duke's betrothed. That meant she existed in strange territory between guest and authority, permitted but not trusted, acknowledged but not embraced. She found a gallery overlooking the eastern valley. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed landscapes that stretched toward horizons lost in morning mist. Mountains, forests, rivers cutting through terrain too rough for anything but the hardiest settlements. This was why Blackthorne mattered. This was why the Duke's control over these territories represented power that kings envied. Whoever held these lands controlled trade routes, controlled resources, controlled the entire northern economy. Impressive, isn't it? Seraphine spun. A man stood in the gallery entrance, mid-30s, handsome in a way that suggested he knew it and used it strategically. Expensive clothing cut to display wealth without looking desperate about it. Dark eyes that assessed her with calculation that reminded her uncomfortably of Vaelor's gaze, though lacking the same edge of absolute certainty. "I'm sorry," she said carefully. "I don't believe we've been introduced." The man smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Lord Cassian Mordrell. I handle trade negotiations for several of the noble families in the Eastern Territories, which means I handle negotiations with Duke Draven frequently enough that his fortress has become unfortunately familiar." The name hit like cold water. This was the rival Vaelor had mentioned, the man who'd absorbed her father's territories after the gambling debts came due, standing here, in Blackthorne, looking at her like she was an opportunity rather than a person. "Lady Seraphine Vael," she replied, keeping her voice neutral. "Though I suppose in 3 days that name will change." "Yes. Congratulations on your upcoming marriage. Very strategic. The Duke has always understood that power requires proper alliances." Cassian moved closer, stopping just inside proper social distance. "Though I admit, I'm curious how someone from House Vael ended up here. Your father and I had discussed alternative arrangements before the Duke made his counteroffer." Alternative arrangements. A marriage between yourself and my younger brother would have consolidated the Eastern Territories under a single banner, much more efficient than splitting control between Blackthorne and Mordrell interests. His smile sharpened. "But the Duke outbid me. He has a talent for that." Seraphine felt something cold slide down her spine. This man had wanted to purchase her just like Vaelor had, reduce her to a transaction in territorial power plays. The only difference was packaging. "I wasn't aware I was a commodity available for bidding." Everything's a commodity if you find the right market. Your father understood that better than most, though his understanding of timing was considerably less developed. Sold to the wrong buyer at the wrong price. Cassian's eyes never left hers. "Still, what's done is done. I'm sure you'll find Blackthorne educational." "Is that a warning?" It's an observation. The Duke rules through fear, very effective in the short term, but empires built on terror tend to collapse the moment the terror loses its edge. Something to consider as you're learning your new role as Lady Draven. Before Seraphine could respond, footsteps echoed in the corridor. Aldrich appeared, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes hard as flint when he saw Cassian. "Lord Mordrell, I wasn't aware you had an appointment with the Duke today." "I don't. I was concluding business with Lord Thane regarding grain shipments and thought I'd pay my respects to the Duke's betrothed before departing." Cassian turned back to Seraphine, offering a shallow bow. "Lady Vael, I look forward to seeing you at the banquet. I'm sure you'll be radiant in Draven colors." He left. Aldrich waited until the footsteps faded before speaking. "Lady Vael, the Duke's instructions were clear. South wing only. This gallery is in the south wing. This gallery overlooks restricted areas. More importantly, allowing Lord Mordrell access to you without supervision was profoundly unwise. That man would skin his own mother if it advanced his territorial claims, and you just gave him 15 minutes to assess whether the Duke's new bride represents weakness or strength in Blackthorne's position." Seraphine's hands curled into fists. "I didn't give him anything. He was already here. He was here because his meeting ended 10 minutes ago, and he delayed departure specifically to engineer an introduction, which means he's already investigating whether you're an asset or a liability to the Duke's control over the Eastern Territories." Aldrich's voice dropped. "Understand something. You're not a guest. You're not a citizen. Right now, you're a strategic resource that every noble family in this region wants to evaluate, corrupt, or eliminate, depending on how you affect their positioning. Lord Mordrell just fired the opening shot in that war. How you respond in the next 3 days will determine whether you survive it." The words landed like physical blows. Seraphine had known intellectually that her marriage to Vaelor was political, but hearing it stated so bluntly, understanding that she'd just become a game piece in conflicts she didn't understand, drove home exactly how precarious her position really was. What should I have done differently? Mistress. Walked away the moment you saw him. Returned to your chambers. Sent for guards. Literally anything except engaging in conversation that allowed him to gather intelligence about your personality, intelligence level, and potential vulnerabilities. Aldrich studied her. The Duke chose you because your father's collapse provided opportunity. But that doesn't mean you're suited for this environment. 3 of his previous wives proved that reality quite definitively. I'm not his previous wives. No, you're significantly less trained and considerably more likely to make mistakes that result in either your death or his political embarrassment. Both outcomes are unacceptable. So when I tell you to stay in authorized areas and avoid unauthorized contact with rival nobles, I'm not being petty. I'm trying to keep you alive long enough to possibly become useful. The brutal honesty of it stung worse than cruelty would have, because Aldrich wasn't trying to hurt her. He was just explaining reality with the same cold precision Vaelor used. This was how Blackthorne operated. Survival through discipline, success through calculated risk management, failure through sentiment and mistakes. I understand. I doubt that, but you'll learn. Follow me. The Duke is waiting. They descended through corridors that Seraphine was slowly learning to navigate. Down, east, through a gallery hung with battle standards captured from defeated enemies. The names embroidered on those flags represented kingdoms and dynasties that no longer existed. Every banner was a story about what happened when someone challenged Draven supremacy and lost. They reached a set of reinforced doors. Aldrich knocked once. The door opened from the inside. The war room was exactly what the name suggested. A massive space dominated by a table covered in maps and documents and markers representing military positions. Walls lined with weapons and armor. Windows overlooking training yards where soldiers drilled in formation. Everything about the space screamed strategic planning and violent enforcement. Vaelor stood at the table, studying a map marked with territorial boundaries and trade routes. He didn't look up when Seraphine entered. Lord Mordrel made contact with her in the East Gallery. 15-minute conversation before I interrupted. Vaelor's hands stilled on the map. He looked up slowly and stilled on those cold eyes focusing on Seraphine with intensity that made her want to step backward. What did he say? That he'd attempted to arrange a marriage between myself and his brother before you made your counteroffer. That empires built on terror eventually collapse. That Blackthorne would be educational. Seraphine kept her voice level. I didn't seek him out. He was already there when I arrived. Of course he was. Cassian Mordrel hasn't made an unconsidered move in 15 years. He delayed departure specifically to assess whether my new bride represents stability or weakness in my control over the Eastern territories. Vaelor straightened. What was your assessment of him? The question surprised her. My assessment? You have eyes, you have a brain. Presumably you formed opinions during your conversation. I'm asking what they were. Seraphine considered. This felt like another test. Answer too carefully and he'd think she was intimidated. Answer too casually and he'd think she was careless. The truth seemed like the only path that wouldn't immediately fail. He's smart, confident, views people as resources rather than humans. Probably dangerous if crossed. And he's probing for weaknesses in your position by determining whether I'm an asset worth corrupting or a liability worth eliminating. Vaelor's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Approval, maybe. Or recognition. Accurate. Cassian Mordrel controls 40% of the eastern trade routes and maintains alliances with 6 noble families who'd like nothing better than to see Blackthorne's influence reduced. Your father's territories defaulted to him when the debts came due, which gave him strategic positioning I've spent 8 months working to counter. This marriage disrupts his consolidation efforts because it aligns House Vael's remaining credibility with Draven interests. He moved around the table, studying the map like it was a battlefield rather than geography. At the banquet tomorrow night, Cassian will test you. He'll push boundaries, make suggestions, try to determine whether you're loyal to Blackthorne or just another desperate noble playing survival politics, while secretly hoping Draven power collapses so you can renegotiate your position. How you respond will determine whether he views this marriage as a genuine threat to his ambitions or simply an inconvenience to work around. And what response do you want? I want you to understand that everyone in that hall tomorrow night exists in a state of constant calculation. They smile while planning murders. They toast alliances while funding rebellions. They swear loyalty while searching for weaknesses. The moment they identify you as vulnerable, they'll exploit it. The moment they identify you as dangerous, they'll attempt to neutralize you. Your survival depends on being neither vulnerable nor dangerous, just competent enough to be useful and unpredictable enough to require caution. He returned to the map, fingers tracing trade routes that connected territories across the northern regions. Cassian will approach you again tomorrow night. When he does, you'll be gracious but not friendly. You'll acknowledge his position without appearing impressed by it. And most importantly, you'll make it clear that your loyalty to Blackthorne is absolute not because you fear me, but because you've assessed the political landscape and determined that Draven interests align with your own survival. That calculation is something he'll understand and respect. Seraphine watched him manipulate markers on the map, each small adjustment representing decisions that affected thousands of lives. This was what power looked like. Not rage, not cruelty, just cold assessment and strategic positioning refined until it became instinct. You're teaching me how to lie. Oh, I'm teaching you how to survive. The difference is semantic. Vaelor looked up. At this banquet, you'll meet 15 noble families. All of them will assess you. All of them will form opinions about whether this marriage strengthens or weakens Blackthorne's position. Those opinions will shape alliances, trade agreements, and how many assassination attempts I'll need to counter in the next 6 months. Your performance tomorrow determines whether I'm spending resources protecting you or replacing you. What is she? Mom, the words should have been terrifying. Instead, they crystallized something in Seraphine's mind. This wasn't about romance or partnership. This was about proving she deserved the protection that came with being Lady Draven. Earn her place or lose it. Simple. Brutal. Clear. Then I suggest you tell me everything I need to know about those 15 families, because I didn't survive my father's collapse just to become a footnote in Blackthorne's history. For the first time since she'd arrived, Vaelor smiled. Not warmth, but something colder and infinitely more valuable. Respect. Aldrich, cancel my afternoon meetings. We have work to do. They spent 6 hours in the war room. Vaelor taught her like a general briefing soldiers before battle. Each noble family represented different interests, different vulnerabilities, different degrees of threat. House Thane controlled lumber and construction. House Corrin managed southern fortifications. House Vex held mining rights in the northern mountains. Each family maintained careful balance between cooperation with Blackthorne and preservation of their own autonomy. The key, Vaelor explained while marking family positions on the map, is understanding that none of them actually want Blackthorne to collapse. My control keeps the region stable. Stable regions generate profit. Profitable regions keep noble families wealthy and powerful. But they also don't want me strong enough to eliminate their independence entirely. So they maintain this careful dance, loyal enough to avoid retribution, independent enough to preserve options if my power weakens. Seraphine studied the map, and Cassian Mordril sits at the center of that tension. Cassian represents the alternative, a coalition government where power is distributed across multiple families rather than consolidated under Draven authority. It sounds appealing. Democracy, shared decision-making. Until you remember that shared power means endless debate, political gridlock, and vulnerability to external threats. The southern kingdoms would invade within 6 months if they thought the northern territories had fractured into competing interests rather than unified under single command. So you're not just a tyrant, you're a necessary tyrant. I'm the tyrant who keeps everyone else alive and prosperous. There's a difference. Vaelor's finger traced supply lines cutting through mountain passes. These routes feed 8 territories. If they're disrupted, 3,000 people starve before spring. I maintain those routes through force when necessary and deterrence always. Cassian maintains them through negotiated tariffs and diplomatic agreements that take 6 months to finalize. My approach is ruthless. His approach is sophisticated. But when bandits attack a supply convoy, only one approach keeps people fed. He moved to a different section of the map. Tomorrow night, you will sit beside me during the banquet. 6 courses, 4 hours. Every conversation will be a negotiation. Every smile will carry calculation. Lady Corrin will compliment your dress while assessing whether you're intelligent enough to be worth cultivating as an ally. Lord Thane will ask about your father while determining if House Vale's collapse makes you desperate enough to betray Blackthorne interests, if properly motivated. And Cassian will watch everything, measuring, calculating, searching for the exact pressure point that transforms you from asset to liability. Seraphine absorbed the information like she was preparing for an exam, where failure meant death. Because that's exactly what it was. What happens if I fail this test? Vaelor's expression went carefully blank. Then I'll need to reconsider whether this marriage serves its strategic purpose. Replacing you would be inconvenient, but not impossible. Alliances can be rebuilt. Territorial positioning can be renegotiated. What can't be recovered is credibility lost by keeping a weak partner in a position of visibility. The words landed like a blade between her ribs. Cold. Precise. Absolute. She wasn't his wife. She was a strategic asset being evaluated for continued use. I won't fail. Good. Because I don't have patience for failure, and the alternatives to this marriage are considerably less appealing for everyone involved. They continued until evening shadows stretched across the war room floor. Aldrich brought food. They ate while studying documents outlining trade agreements and historical conflicts and family genealogies going back generations. Seraphine's head pounded with information overload, but she forced herself to absorb every detail. Names, relationships, vulnerabilities, strengths, everything she'd need to navigate tomorrow's battlefield disguised as a banquet. When Vaelor finally released her, full darkness had settled over Blackthorne. She walked back to her chambers accompanied by guards who maintained careful distance. Professional, silent, just close enough to intervene if she tried wandering somewhere unauthorized. Mira waited in her chambers with evening clothing and a bath that steamed in the cold air. The Duke kept you late. The Duke kept me alive. There's a difference. Seraphine sank into the bath, letting hot water ease muscles locked tight from hours of tension. Her mind still spun with family names and territorial maps, and the brutal reality that tomorrow night would determine whether she survived Blackthorne or became another cautionary tale about women who couldn't handle the ruthless clarity of Draven power. She'd thought her father's collapse was the worst thing that could happen. She'd been wrong. This was worse, because at least her father's failure had been quick. Gambling debts, bankruptcy, consequences delivered with the efficiency of a blade through the heart. This was slow, calculated, a test that never ended because the moment she proved herself useful, new challenges would emerge, new threats, new calculations, forever walking the edge between asset and liability in a world where sentiment was weakness and loyalty meant nothing beyond strategic advantage. She'd never hated her father more than she did in that moment, not for gambling away their fortune, but for raising her to believe nobility meant honor and family, meant something beyond transactions measured in territorial control and political positioning. He'd lied. Or worse, he'd actually believed those lies himself, which made him not just weak, but delusional. Seraphine dressed for bed in silence. Mira left. Guards changed shifts outside her door. The fortress breathed around her, ancient and patient, waiting to see if she'd survive long enough to become part of its history or just another ghost story. Whispered in corridors when people needed reminding about what happened to those who couldn't adapt. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt something colder settling deeper. Not acceptance, but recognition. This was her reality now. Survive it or die. Those were the only options. She'd chosen survival. Now she just had to prove she was ruthless enough to mean it. Tomorrow night would be her first real test. And somewhere in Blackthorne Keep, Duke Vaelor Draven was probably still in his war room, studying maps and making calculations that reduced human lives to markers representing strategic positioning, including hers. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it clarified something fundamental. If she was just a marker on his map, then she'd become the one marker he couldn't afford to lose. Not through sentiment, through necessity. Make herself too valuable to discard, too useful to replace, too dangerous to underestimate. That was how she'd survive Blackthorne, by becoming exactly what this fortress demanded. Something harder than stone, something colder than winter. Something ruthless enough to stand beside the Duke, who'd built an empire from fear and absolute certainty. Outside, wolves howled. Closer now. Always closer. But Seraphine Vael wasn't prey anymore. Tomorrow night, she'd prove that to everyone watching, starting with the ruthless Duke himself. The morning of the banquet arrived with frost coating the windows like shattered glass. Seraphine woke before dawn, her mind already racing through everything Vaelor had drilled into her the previous day. 15 noble families, each one a potential threat, each one calculating whether the Duke's new bride represented strength or a crack in Blackthorne's armor that could be exploited. She dressed in darkness, refusing Mira's help, needing the solitude to prepare herself for what was coming. The clothing laid out was deliberate. Black silk with silver threading that caught light like captured starlight, Draven colors. A walking declaration that she belonged to Blackthorne now. That House Vael had been absorbed completely into the machinery of the Duke's power. When Mira finally entered, she found Seraphine already dressed, standing at the window watching guards drill in the courtyard below. Their movements were perfectly synchronized. A single organism designed for violence. That's what Blackthorne demanded. Perfect synchronization, absolute discipline. No room for individual weakness because weakness infected everything it touched. You're one of those pieces now, Seraphine thought, watching her reflection in the frost-covered glass. Move wrong, and the whole formation collapses. Move right, and you become part of something that can't be broken. Mira approached with jewelry. A necklace of black diamonds that probably cost more than House Vael's entire remaining estate. Earrings that matched. Rings that transformed Seraphine's hands into displays of wealth and ownership. "The Duke sends his regards and his requirements," the jewelry whispered. "Wear me well or be replaced." "You look like you belong here," Mira said quietly, fastening the necklace. Her fingers were steady, but her eyes carried something else. Warning, maybe, or recognition of someone about to walk into a battle they might not survive. "Do I?" "You look dangerous." "That's close enough." "Dangerous." The words settled into Seraphine's chest like a blade, finding home between ribs. Not a compliment, a necessity. Because safe things got devoured in environments like Blackthorne. Only dangerous things commanded respect. She studied herself in the mirror. The woman staring back wasn't the desperate daughter who'd arrived in chains 3 days ago. This woman looked like she could stand in a hall full of predators and make them remember that some prey evolved into something that bit back. Good, she thought. Let them see teeth instead of weakness. A knock interrupted her preparation. Aldrich entered without waiting for permission, his expression carrying the same weathered neutrality, but his movements were more precise than usual, controlled tension, the kind that came from managing situations where one mistake cost lives. "The Duke requests your presence in the Great Hall. The first guests will arrive within the hour, and he wants final confirmations before the performance begins." Performance. Not banquet, not celebration. Performance. Because that's what tonight was. Theater designed to convince 15 noble families that Blackthorne's power remained absolute, despite the strategic complications of acquiring a bride from a collapsed house. Seraphine followed Aldrich through corridors she was beginning to recognize. Down, east, through galleries where morning light hadn't yet reached, and shadows clung to stone like they were part of the architecture itself. Guards watched them pass with the same cold assessment they gave everything, measuring threats, calculating responses. Never resting because rest meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant death. They reached the Great Hall. The transformation was stunning and terrible. What had been an empty cathedral of power 3 days ago had become something else entirely. Tables arranged in careful hierarchy. The Duke's table elevated on the platform, positioned so everyone below would have to look up to see him. Lesser tables spreading outward in concentric circles, each position calculated to demonstrate exactly where each family ranked in Blackthorne's estimation. Hundreds of candles burned in iron chandeliers suspended from chains thick enough to anchor ships. The light they threw was warm and golden and completely dishonest because nothing in this hall was warm. It was all calculation dressed in elegance, violence wrapped in silk. Vaelor stood near his table, dressed in formal armor that managed to look ceremonial and functional simultaneously. Black steel etched with silver designs that caught candlelight like frozen lightning. A sword hung at his hip, not decorative but working steel that had seen recent use. The message wasn't subtle. The Duke might host banquets, but he never stopped being a weapon. He turned when Seraphine entered. His eyes traveled over her with the same clinical assessment he'd given the hall arrangements. Measuring. Calculating. Determining if she'd followed instructions or if corrections would be necessary. Something shifted in his expression. Not approval exactly, but acknowledgement. She dressed correctly, worn the jewelry properly, transformed herself into exactly what tonight required. A strategic asset worth displaying. Good, he said simply. You understand presentation. I understand survival. They're the same thing in environments like this. Vaelor gestured toward the tables. You'll sit beside me. Lady Corin will be on your left. She'll probe for weaknesses disguised as friendly conversation. Be gracious, but reveal nothing substantive about your opinions on territorial management or family alliances. Lord Thane sits 3 places down. He'll ask about your father. Acknowledge the question, but pivot immediately to discussing Blackthorne's stability. Make it clear that House Vael's collapse was your father's failure, not a reflection of your capabilities. He moved along the table, fingers trailing across the surface like he was reading invisible maps. Cassian Mordrel will sit at the second table, close enough to participate in conversation, but positioned so everyone remembers he's not inner circle despite his wealth. That will irritate him. When he approaches you later, that irritation will make him careless. Careless men reveal their strategies. Your job is to listen, acknowledge, and give him nothing he can use to determine whether you're a genuine threat to his consolidation efforts or just a placeholder I'll discard when something better becomes available. Seraphine studied the seating arrangement. Every position told a story about power and proximity and who mattered in the brutal hierarchy of Blackthorne politics. She was seated beside the Duke, the highest position available, but that elevation also made her the most visible target. Everyone would be watching her tonight. Every word would be analyzed, every expression interpreted. One mistake and she'd prove herself unworthy of the protection that came with being Lady Draven. No pressure, she thought bitterly. Just perform flawlessly in front of people who'd happily orchestrate your death if it served their interests. What if I make a mistake? Vaelor's gaze locked onto hers. Then you recover immediately and make them believe the mistake was calculated. Weakness is only fatal if you acknowledge it, deny it, redirect, transform it into something else entirely. That's how you survive rooms full of people who view your existence as either opportunity or threat. The doors at the far end of the hall opened. Servants streamed in carrying platters and goblets and the 1,000 small details that would transform this space into the stage for tonight's performance. Vaelor watched them work with the same intensity he probably gave battlefield preparations. One more thing, he said quietly, moving closer so only Seraphine could hear. Tonight, several people will attempt to plant seeds of doubt about Blackthorne's stability. They'll mention unrest in the southern territories, whisper about noble families questioning my methods, suggest that my approach to governance is becoming unsustainable. All of it is designed to determine if you're loyal enough to Blackthorne to defend its interests, or if you're secretly hoping my power collapses so you can renegotiate your position. His hand rested on his sword hilt, casual, unconscious. A man so accustomed to violence that the weapon had become an extension of his body. When those conversations happen, remember that everyone in this hall exists because I've been ruthless enough to keep them alive. Their wealth comes from trade routes I protect. Their safety comes from rebellions I've crushed. Their entire existence depends on Blackthorne remaining strong enough to hold the northern territories together. The moment they forget that, they become threats. And threats get eliminated. The words carried no heat, no anger, just cold certainty about how his world operated. Loyalty through necessity, obedience through calculation. Fear refined until it became indistinguishable from respect. Seraphine understood then what tonight really was. Not just a test of her capabilities, but a demonstration to every noble family watching that Duke Vaelor Draven had acquired something new and potentially dangerous. A bride who might be capable enough to strengthen Blackthorne's position or weak enough to become a vulnerability that needed addressing. The outcome would determine whether she lived long enough to see spring. I won't give them ammunition. Good. Because replacing you would be inconvenient, and I've invested resources in this marriage that I'd prefer not to waste. He turned away, already focused on the next detail that required attention. Seraphine stood alone in that massive hall, surrounded by empty tables that would soon hold people who wanted her to fail, and felt something cold settle deeper into her bones. Not fear exactly, but recognition of exactly how high the stakes had become. Tonight, she'd prove herself worthy of Blackthorne. Or tonight she'd become a cautionary tale about what happened when weakness tried to survive in environments built from strength and absolute certainty. There was no middle ground, no partial success, just survival or erasure. She'd chosen survival. Now she had to be ruthless enough to mean it. The first guests arrived as twilight painted the sky the color of bruises. Seraphine stood beside Vaelor on the platform, watching noble families filter into the hall with the practiced grace of people who'd spent lifetimes navigating environments where one wrong step meant political destruction. Lady Corrin entered first, mid-40s. Beautiful in the calculated way of women who understood that appearance was a weapon as dangerous as any blade. Her dress cost a fortune but was cut to suggest wealth without desperation. Her jewelry sparkled but didn't overwhelm. Everything about her presentation screamed sophistication and careful control. She approached the platform with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Duke Draven. How wonderful to see Blackthorne so brilliantly prepared for celebration, and this must be the lovely Lady Vale I've heard so much about. Vaelor inclined his head fractionally.
Lady Corrin, may I present Lady Seraphine Vale, soon to be Lady Draven. Seraphine, Lady Corrin oversees the southern fortifications and maintains considerable influence over military supply routes.
Seraphine extended her hand. Lady Corrin took it with fingers that were soft, but the grip carried surprising strength. A test, measuring whether the Duke's new bride understood physical presence mattered as much as words. Seraphine matched the pressure, held it, released at exactly the same moment. Lady Corrin, I've heard your management of the southern defenses is why bandits avoid those territories entirely. Something flickered in Corrin's eyes. Approval, maybe. Or recalculation. Intelligence is such a refreshing quality in a bride. So many of the Duke's previous acquisitions were selected purely for strategic value without regard for whether they possessed functioning minds. Her smile sharpened. I look forward to our conversation during dinner. I'm quite curious about your perspectives on territorial management, given your family's recent experiences with collapse. The words landed like a blade disguised as compliment. Seraphine felt the trap immediately. Acknowledge House Vale's failure, and she appeared weak. Defend her father, and she appeared delusional about the reality of his incompetence. She chose the third option, redirect and attack. My father's failures taught me more about effective governance than most people learn from success. Watching power collapse because of weakness and sentiment created rather clear perspective on what's required to maintain it. Blackthorne's stability speaks to Duke Draven's understanding of those requirements. Lady Corrin's expression didn't change, but her eyes narrowed fractionally. The Duke's new bride had just defended Blackthorne's ruthlessness while simultaneously distancing herself from her father's weakness. Sophisticated positioning for someone who'd arrived in chains less than a week ago. Indeed, how fortunate for everyone involved. She moved toward her assigned table. I look forward to continuing this conversation, Lady Vale. Vaelor waited until she was out of earshot before speaking quietly. Well done. You acknowledged the question, defended my methods, and implied your loyalty is based on calculation rather than fear. That's exactly what tonight requires. More guests arrived. Lord Thane, barrel-chested and loud, who controlled lumber rights across 3 territories. House Vex, who'd made fortunes mining northern mountains. House Rain. House Blackwell. House Sterling. Each a family carried generations of history and carefully maintained power balanced against Blackthorne's dominance. And then Cassian Mordril entered. He moved through the hall like he owned it, confident, handsome, dressed in clothing that probably cost more than some families earned in years, but worn with casual ease that suggested wealth was just another tool rather than an achievement. His eyes found Seraphine immediately, held her gaze for 3 seconds too long to be polite, a challenge disguised as acknowledgement. Vaelor's hand tightened fractionally on his sword hilt. The movement was so subtle Seraphine almost missed it, but she'd been watching him closely enough to catch the micro-expression. The Duke who faced down assassins without flinching had just revealed something important. Cassian Mordril genuinely threatened him, not physically, but strategically. The man represented an alternative to Blackthorne's concentrated power, a coalition approach that appealed to noble families who wanted prosperity without submitting completely to Draven authority. And Cassian knew it, used it, weaponized the appeal of shared governance against the reality of Vaelor's iron control.
Duke Draven, Cassian said, approaching the platform with a smile that managed to be both respectful and mocking simultaneously. "Thank you for including me in tonight's celebration, and Lady Vale, you look absolutely stunning in Draven colors. Though I confess, I'd wondered if green might suit you better given House Vale's traditional preferences." Another trap. Acknowledge Vale colors and she appeared disloyal to Blackthorne. Reject them entirely and she appeared desperate to please her new master. Seraphine met his eyes without flinching. House Vale's colors represented what we were. Draven Black represents what I'm becoming. I've always preferred futures to histories, Lord Mordrell. Cassian's smile widened. How very pragmatic. The Duke has chosen well. Beauty and calculated ambition. Such a rare combination. He moved to his assigned table. Vaelor watched him settle into position, surrounded by allies who'd benefit from Blackthorne's influence weakening. "He's testing whether you're intelligent enough to be worth corrupting," Vaelor said quietly. "When he approaches you later, and he will, he'll offer alternative perspectives on governance. Make it sound reasonable, tempting even. Your response will determine whether he views you as a potential ally against my interests or just another loyal piece in Blackthorne's machinery. What response do you want? I want you to be smart enough that I don't need to script your responses. Figure it out yourself. That's what I'm paying for." The words stung worse than cruelty, because he was right. If she couldn't navigate these conversations without constant guidance, she was just a puppet wearing expensive jewelry. Useless beyond the immediate symbolism of the marriage itself. "Prove you're worth keeping," the cold voice in her head whispered. "Prove you can think instead of just performing memorized lines." The banquet began with formal declarations. Vaelor stood, his voice carrying across the hall with absolute authority. "Noble families of the northern territories, tonight we gather to celebrate alliances that have kept these lands prosperous and stable for generations. The marriage between House Draven and House Vale represents continuation of that stability. Together we face southern kingdoms that view our independence as threat. Together we manage trade routes that feed 8 territories. Together we maintain order that allows civilization to flourish in lands that would otherwise collapse into tribal warfare." He paused, letting the words settle. "Some among you question whether concentrated power serves the greater good, whether distributed authority might create more equitable outcomes. These are reasonable questions, but they ignore fundamental reality. Shared power means shared responsibility. Shared responsibility means endless debate when decisions require immediate action. When bandits attack supply convoys, we don't have time for committee meetings. We need decisive response. That's what Blackthorne provides. Swift, certain, absolute." His eyes swept the hall, touching each table, each family, each potential threat. "So tonight we celebrate not just a marriage, but the continuation of strength that keeps all of you alive and prosperous. Remember that. When you're tempted to question my methods, when you wonder if alternative approaches might serve your interests better, remember that everything you have exists because Blackthorne has been ruthless enough to protect it." Silence filled the hall. Then slowly, applause. Measured, calculated. The sound of people who understood exactly what they'd just heard. Not an invitation to celebrate. A reminder about who held the knife and what happened when people forgot that fundamental reality. The first course arrived. Servants moved between tables with mechanical efficiency. Seraphine barely tasted the food. Her attention was locked on conversations happening around her. Lady Corrin speaking quietly with Lord Thane. House Vex exchanging glances with House Blackwell. Cassian watching everything with the same calculating intensity Vaelor used. This wasn't a banquet. It was intelligence gathering disguised as celebration. Every conversation contained multiple layers. Surface politeness. Hidden calculation. Strategies being tested and refined based on reactions too subtle for casual observation. Lady Corrin leaned toward Seraphine during the second course. "Tell me, dear, how are you finding Blackthorne? The fortress can be rather overwhelming for those unaccustomed to its particular atmosphere." Translation: Are you frightened? Are you malleable? Can I use you? Seraphine kept her expression neutral. "I find it refreshingly honest. Everyone here understands exactly what's required for survival. There's no pretense about sentiment or honor disguising the reality of power dynamics." Corrin's eyebrows lifted fractionally.
How very astute, though some might argue that governance without sentiment becomes indistinguishable from tyranny. But all say, and some might argue that sentiment without strength becomes indistinguishable from suicide. My father governed with plenty of sentiment. Look where it got House Vael. Silence stretched between them. Lady Corin studied Seraphine like she was re-examining earlier assessments. You're not what I expected. I'm exactly what Blackthorne requires. Whether that aligns with expectations is irrelevant. Corin smiled, genuine this time. The Duke chose better than I anticipated. Good. We need intelligence in leadership positions. Too many of the recent marriages have been purely transactional, without regard for whether the brides possessed useful capabilities. She turned back to her meal. Seraphine exhaled slowly, feeling tension release from muscles she hadn't realized were locked. First test passed. Lady Corin had probed for weakness and found calculation instead. That wouldn't make her an ally, but it might make her cautious about treating Seraphine as a vulnerability to exploit. The courses continued. Wine flowed. Conversations ebbed and surged around themes of trade and territory and carefully veiled threats disguised as observations about regional stability. Vaelor participated minimally, speaking only when directly addressed, his presence dominating the room through silence rather than engagement. He's letting them talk, Seraphine realized, watching who aligns with whom, who drinks too much and reveals strategies they'd normally conceal. He's gathering intelligence while they think they're just socializing. The insight clarified something fundamental about how Blackthorne operated. Vaelor didn't rule through constant violence, he ruled through information. Knowing who plotted what, who harbored ambitions, who could be trusted and who needed watching. Violence was just the tool he used when information revealed threats requiring elimination. After the fourth course, servants cleared tables and musicians filled the hall with careful melodies. Dancing would begin soon. Social mixing that created opportunities for private conversations away from the central platform. That's when Cassian would make his move. Seraphine knew it with absolute certainty. He'd approach during the dancing, isolate her from Vaelor's immediate oversight, test her loyalty when she didn't have the Duke's presence reinforcing Blackthorne's narrative. She wasn't wrong. Cassian appeared beside her within minutes of the dancing beginning. He extended his hand with practiced charm. Lady Vael, would you honor me with a dance? I promised to be significantly less intimidating than our previous conversation suggested. Vaelor's eyes locked onto them from across the hall. He didn't object, didn't interfere, just watched with the same cold calculation he gave everything. Another test, letting her navigate this alone, measuring whether she'd been paying attention to everything he'd taught her. Seraphine took Cassian's hand, let him guide her onto the floor where dozens of couples moved in synchronized patterns beneath crystal chandeliers that threw fractured light across the polished marble. Cassian danced well. Of course he did. Men like him mastered every social skill that might provide advantage. He held her properly, moved with practiced ease, made the interaction feel natural despite the calculation underlying every movement. You impressed Lady Corin tonight, he said quietly, voice pitched so only Seraphine could hear. That's no small achievement. She's notoriously difficult to impress, and she loathes most of Duke Draven's acquisitions. I'm not an acquisition. I'm a strategic alliance. Semantics, though I admire your commitment to the narrative. His hand tightened fractionally on her waist, not threatening, just establishing presence. Tell me something honestly. Are you here because you believe Blackthorne represents your best option for survival? Or because you literally had no alternatives after your father's collapse? The question cut deeper than anything Lady Corin had attempted, because it forced Seraphine to acknowledge the ugly reality. She hadn't chosen Vaelor. She'd been purchased like livestock to settle debts she never owed. But Cassian was probing for weakness, searching for resentment he could cultivate into disloyalty. Don't give him ammunition, Vaelor's voice echoed in her memory. Make them believe your loyalty is based on calculation rather than fear. I'm here because I assessed my options and determined that Blackthorne's stability offered better outcomes than any alternative, including whatever arrangement you attempted to negotiate with my father before Duke Draven made his counteroffer. Cassian's eyes sharpened. You know about that. I know everything relevant to my survival. Your proposal involved marrying me to your younger brother, consolidating Eastern territories under Mordrell control. It was strategically sound, but it assumed House Vale had enough remaining credibility to make the alliance valuable. We didn't. The Duke understood that, made his offer accordingly. You lost because you miscalculated my father's actual position versus his perceived position. They turned through the dance. Other couples swirled around them. Seraphine caught glimpses of Vaelor watching from the platform. His expression revealed nothing, but she knew he was listening. Probably had guards close enough to hear every word being exchanged. Cassian smiled, but it didn't touch his eyes. You're more astute than I expected. That's dangerous. For you, I mean. Intelligence makes you threatening. Threatening people in Blackthorne tend to experience unfortunate accidents. Is that a warning or a threat? It's an observation. Duke Draven rules through fear, very effective. But empires built on terror eventually collapse when the terror loses its edge. I'm offering perspective. When that collapse happens, you'll want allies who govern through cooperation rather than intimidation. The trap was elegant. Cassian was planting seeds, making Blackthorne's strength sound like eventual weakness. Positioning himself as the reasonable alternative, all while dancing beneath chandeliers in the Duke's own fortress. Seraphine met his eyes directly. You're right about one thing. Terror eventually loses its edge, but you're wrong about why Blackthorne endures. It's not fear that keeps these territories stable. It's certainty. People know exactly what happens when they cooperate and exactly what happens when they don't. That predictability creates an environment where trade flourishes and settlements prosper because everyone understands the rules. Your coalition approach sounds appealing until you remember that shared power means endless negotiation, endless debate, endless vulnerability to whoever shouts loudest or pays most. I didn't escape my father's weakness just to embrace a different version of the same failure. Cassian's smile finally faded. You're defending tyranny. I'm defending results. Everything else is just philosophy. That doesn't matter when people need to eat and roads need protecting and rebellions need crushing before they spread. Duke Draven provides those results. Your coalition provides committee meetings. I know which approach keeps people alive. The music ended. Cassian released her but didn't step back. His expression had transformed into something colder, more calculating. The friendly mask had cracked enough to reveal the predator beneath. You've made your position clear, Lady Vale. I hope it serves you well. Though I suspect you'll discover that loyalty to tyrants is only rewarded as long as you remain useful. And usefulness is such a temporary condition in environments like Blackthorne. He walked away. Seraphine stood alone on the dance floor, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone in the hall must be able to hear it. She'd just burned a bridge, declared absolute loyalty to Blackthorne in terms that left no room for misinterpretation. Cassian would report that conversation to his allies. They'd know the Duke's new bride wasn't corruptible, wasn't secretly hoping for Blackthorne's collapse, was genuinely committed to defending Draven interests, which meant she'd just transformed herself from potential asset to confirmed threat in the calculations of every family that wanted Vaelor's power reduced. She'd just painted a target on herself that wouldn't disappear. Vaelor appeared beside her so smoothly she didn't see him approach. His hand touched her elbow, gentle but firm, guiding her back toward the platform with possession disguised as courtesy. What did he offer? Vaelor asked quietly. Perspective, warnings about tyranny, suggestions that your empire is built on foundations that can't sustain long-term stability. And your response? That I prefer results to philosophy, and Blackthorne delivers results while his coalition delivers committee meetings. I made it clear my loyalty isn't negotiable. Vaelor's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Not warmth, but recognition. Acknowledgement that she'd just passed a test most people failed. You understand what you just did. Cassian will report that conversation to 6 noble families within the hour. They'll know you're not conflicted about Blackthorne's methods, not secretly hoping I'll fail so you can renegotiate your position. You're genuinely committed. That makes you dangerous to everyone who wants my power reduced. I know. It also makes you valuable. Dangerous assets are worth protecting because they can't be easily replaced. His hand tightened fractionally on her elbow. You survived tonight. That's more than my previous wives managed. 2 of them tried to use social events like this to build alternative alliances. They thought I wouldn't notice. I noticed everything. Their failures became instructional for everyone watching. The implication hung between them, cold, absolute. He'd eliminated his own wives when they proved disloyal, not through rage, just through calculated assessment that they'd become liabilities rather than assets. And now Seraphine had committed herself so completely to Blackthorne's interests that betrayal wasn't an option. She'd survive as long as she remained useful. The moment she stopped being valuable, she joined the ghosts in the Eastern Tower. The banquet continued for another hour. More dancing, more wine, more conversations that carried multiple meanings beneath surface politeness. Seraphine participated with mechanical efficiency, her mind still processing what had just happened. She'd chosen survival, but survival in Blackthorne meant permanent commitment. No exit, no alternatives. Just continuous demonstration that she deserved the protection that came with being Lady Draven. When the guests finally departed, filing out through massive doors into winter darkness, Seraphine stood beside Vaelor watching them leave. 15 families, hundreds of people, all of them carrying assessments and calculations and updated strategies based on what they'd witnessed tonight. The Duke's new bride was intelligent, loyal, potentially dangerous, worth watching because she might strengthen Blackthorne's position or create vulnerabilities depending on how she developed. Vaelor waited until the last guest departed before speaking. Tomorrow we marry. The ceremony will be formal but brief. Witnesses from each major family to verify legitimacy. After that, you become Lady Draven permanently. Everything that follows depends on whether you can maintain tonight's performance indefinitely. Because this wasn't a test you passed. It was the beginning of permanent evaluation. Every conversation, every decision, every moment you're visible will be measured against Blackthorne's interests. Failure means replacement. Success means survival. He turned toward her. In the empty hall, with candles burning down and servants clearing tables, he looked less like a duke and more like what he actually was. A weapon that had been honed so completely that humanity had become optional. Do you understand what you've committed yourself to? Seraphine met his eyes, held them, let him see that she wasn't flinching. I understand that I have traded one cage for another. The difference is this cage comes with power if I'm ruthless enough to claim it. My father's cage just came with slow death and humiliation. I'll take power over pity every time. Something almost like approval flickered across Vaelor's face. Good, because pity doesn't survive in Blackthorne. Only strength, only calculation, only people willing to become whatever's required to maintain their position. He walked away, left her standing alone in that massive hall surrounded by the remnants of celebration that had actually been warfare disguised as banquet. Seraphine looked at her hands, the rings, the jewelry. The symbols of belonging to something larger and infinitely more dangerous than herself. Tomorrow she'd marry Duke Vaelor Draven. Tomorrow she'd become Lady of Blackthorne Keep. Tomorrow every alternative would disappear and she'd be locked into this path permanently. No escape, no redemption. Just survival measured in continuous performance until she died or became powerful enough that survival transformed into dominance. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt something colder settling into permanent residence. Not fear, but absolute clarity about what came next. Become indispensable. Become dangerous. Become so valuable that replacing her would cost more than protecting her. That was the only path forward. The only way to transform herself from possession into partner. From liability into asset too critical to discard. Outside, wolves howled. The sound carried through stone walls and empty corridors. Hunting cries. Predators calling to each other in darkness. Seraphine smiled. No warmth in it, just recognition. She'd been prey her entire life. Victim of her father's weakness. Commodity sold to settle debts. Not anymore. Tomorrow she became something else entirely. Tomorrow she became the wolf standing beside Blackthorne's most dangerous predator. And the Northern Territories would learn that the ruthless Duke had finally acquired something worth the title Lady Draven. She turned and walked toward her chambers. Guards fell into step behind her, silent, professional, protecting Blackthorne's newest asset until she proved herself valuable enough to protect herself. 3 days ago she'd arrived in chains. Tomorrow she'd wear a crown. The irony wasn't lost on her. Both were just different types of binding. Both demanded obedience. Both required sacrifice. But crowns came with power, and power was the only thing in this world that mattered when everything else burned away. The wedding would seal her fate, lock her into Blackthorne permanently, transform her into Lady Draven with all the expectations and dangers that title carried. There would be no turning back, no escape, no alternative futures where she remained Seraphine Vael with options and possibilities. That woman was dying tonight. Tomorrow something harder would take her place. Something ruthless enough to survive beside a man who'd built an empire from fear and absolute certainty. Something dangerous enough that enemies would think twice before attacking. Something valuable enough that the ruthless Duke would choose protection over replacement. She reached her chambers, dismissed the guards, locked the door, stood at the window, watching snow fall across mountains that had witnessed centuries of violence and power changing hands. Tomorrow she'd join that history, become part of the machinery that kept Blackthorne standing while weaker kingdoms collapsed. And somewhere in the fortress, Vaelor Draven was probably in his war room, studying maps, making calculations, reducing tomorrow's ceremony to components and strategic positioning, including her, always including her. A marker on his board representing potential value if managed correctly. Seraphine pressed her palm against the frozen glass, let the cold seep into her skin. Let it remind her that warmth was luxury she couldn't afford anymore. Tomorrow, she'd prove she was worth keeping. Or tomorrow, she'd become another ghost story about women who couldn't survive the brutal clarity of Blackthorne Keep. Only one outcome was acceptable, and she'd become whatever was necessary to achieve it. Even if that meant killing the last traces of the woman who'd arrived here believing nobility meant honor and family meant something beyond transactions. That woman was already dead. She just hadn't finished dying yet. Tomorrow would complete the transformation. Tomorrow, Seraphine Vael would disappear completely, and Lady Draven would rise in her place, ruthless, calculating, dangerous enough to stand beside a duke who'd forgotten how to exist without war. The wolves howled again, closer, always closer, circling, waiting. Let them wait. She wasn't their prey anymore. She was becoming something that made even wolves reconsider the hunt. The wedding ceremony took place at dawn in Blackthorne's Cathedral Hall, not the great hall where the banquet had occurred. Something older, more fundamental. A space carved from the mountain itself where Draven ancestors had sworn oaths for 300 years. Seraphine stood in chambers adjacent to the cathedral while Mira fastened the final clasps of her wedding gown. Black silk embroidered with silver thread that caught the pale morning light filtering through narrow windows. No white, no innocence. Just Draven colors announcing to everyone watching that House Vael had been absorbed completely into Blackthorne's machinery. The dress fit like armor, heavy, restrictive, beautiful and terrible simultaneously. A uniform for the role she was about to assume permanently. Mira worked in silence, but her hands trembled slightly. Seraphine noticed, but didn't comment. The younger woman had survived 7 years in Blackthorne by understanding when to speak and when silence served better. This was a silence moment. Words couldn't change what was about to happen. When Mira finished, she stepped back and studied Seraphine with eyes that carried too much knowledge for someone barely 20. "You look like you belong here now," those eyes said. "Like the fortress has already started claiming you. Like whatever you were before is dying and something colder is taking its place." Seraphine didn't ask if that was good or bad. In Blackthorne, moral judgments were luxuries that got people killed. Only results mattered. Only survival. Only proving yourself valuable enough to protect. A knock interrupted the heavy silence. Aldrich entered without waiting for permission. His expression was more controlled than usual. Tension buried so deep, only someone watching closely would catch it. Something's wrong, Seraphine thought immediately. He's holding something back. The Duke requests your presence in the cathedral. The ceremony will begin within the hour. Representatives from all 15 major families are already assembled. This marriage will be witnessed properly and recorded in territorial registries to establish legal legitimacy beyond dispute. His voice carried the same neutral efficiency as always, but his eyes flickered toward Mira for a fraction of a second. A signal. A warning. Something communicated between people who'd survived Blackthorne long enough to develop silent languages. Seraphine felt ice slide down her spine. Whatever was coming, whatever had Aldrich this tightly controlled, it was happening soon. Today. Maybe during the ceremony itself. She followed him through corridors that seemed darker than usual despite morning light trying to penetrate the fortress. Guards lined the route, more than normal, double the usual presence. All of them wearing full combat armor instead of ceremonial dress. Why would a wedding require combat-ready security? Seraphine wondered. Unless someone expects violence, unless threats have been identified and preparations made. They reached the cathedral entrance. Massive wooden doors carved with scenes of ancient battles. Draven victories immortalized in oak and iron. Reminders that this family had survived centuries through ruthlessness and absolute commitment to maintaining power. Aldrich paused before opening the doors. The Duke wanted me to remind you that everything said during this ceremony becomes binding, legal, permanent. Once the oaths are sworn, there's no dissolution, no annulment, no escape. You'll be Lady Draven's until death. His death or yours. Those are the only exits from this marriage. The words landed like stones. Cold. Heavy. Final. I understand. Do you? Because 3 of his previous wives didn't. They thought marriage was negotiable, that circumstances could change their position. They were wrong. Fatally wrong. Don't make their mistake. He opened the doors. The cathedral stretched before her like a throat waiting to swallow. Stone walls rose toward vaulted ceilings lost in shadow. Braziers burned along the perimeter. Flames throwing dancing light across faces turned toward her entrance. 15 noble families. Hundreds of witnesses. All watching to see if the Duke's latest acquisition would successfully transition from commodity to legitimate partner. At the far end, elevated on a platform of black granite, stood Duke Vaelor Draven. He wore formal armor, black steel etched with silver that caught firelight like frozen lightning. A sword hung at his hip despite the ceremonial context. The blade was practical, working steel, a reminder that the man getting married was still fundamentally a weapon that happened to rule territories. His eyes locked onto Seraphine as she began walking down the central aisle. That same cold assessment, always measuring, always calculating, determining if she'd remain useful or become another failure requiring replacement. She kept her spine straight, her pace measured, let everyone see that she wasn't trembling, wasn't frightened, was walking into this commitment with full understanding of what it meant. No illusions about love, no fantasies about partnership, just brutal clarity that this marriage was transaction and she'd better deliver value or join the ghosts in the Eastern Tower. The aisle seemed to stretch forever. Each step echoed against stone that had absorbed 3 centuries of oaths and betrayals and blood. Past Lord Thane's calculating stare. Past Lady Corrin's cool appraisal. Past Cassian Mordrell's expression that mixed contempt and something darker. He knows something, Seraphine realized. Cassian's watching like he's waiting for a show. Like something's about to happen that he's been anticipating. She reached the platform, climbed the steps. Stood beside Vaelor facing the assembled witnesses. A priest emerged from shadows, old, weathered, carrying the kind of age that came from seeing too many ceremonies end badly. He opened an ancient book and began reading words that had bound Draven marriages for generations. The language was formal, archaic, phrases about duty and alliance and permanence that sounded like chains being forged in real time. Seraphine listened with half her attention while the other half monitored the room, watching for threats, searching for whatever had Aldrich so controlled and Cassian so anticipatory. The priest reached the critical section, the binding oaths, the words that would transform her from Seraphine Vael into Lady Draven permanently. Do you, Seraphine of House Vael, swear absolute loyalty to Duke Vaelor Draven and Blackthorne Keep? Do you pledge to defend Draven interests above all other considerations, including birth family, personal preference, and individual survival? Do you accept that this oath cannot be broken, dissolved, or renegotiated under any circumstances, short of death? The words hung in cold air. This was it. The final moment before the cage locked permanently. Last chance to refuse. Last opportunity to reject this path and accept whatever consequences followed. Seraphine looked at Vaelor. His expression revealed nothing, just that same cold calculation waiting to see if she'd prove herself worth the investment. She thought about her father, weak, delusional, destroyed by believing sentiment mattered more than strength. She thought about Ilara, 14 years old, terrified, dependent on Seraphine's choices for her survival. She thought about the alternative, poverty, humiliation, slow death watching House Vael's name disappear into history while creditors picked apart everything their family had built. No alternatives existed, only this path. Only survival through commitment, so absolute that betrayal became impossible. I swear. The words came out steady, clear, binding. Vaelor's hand reached for hers. His grip was firm, possessive, the touch of someone claiming property rather than embracing a partner. The priest turned to him. Do you, Duke Vaelor Draven, accept Seraphine Vael as your wife and Lady of Blackthorne Keep? Do you pledge to protect her as extension of Draven interests for as long as she maintains loyalty to this house and its territories?
Notice the conditional, Seraphine thought bitterly. His oath includes exit clauses. Mine was absolute. His depends on my continued usefulness. The imbalance isn't accidental.
Vaelor's voice carried across the cathedral with absolute authority. I accept. The priest closed the book, raised his hands. By the authority vested in me and witnessed by the assembled noble families of the Northern Territories, I declare this marriage legitimate and binding. Lady Seraphine Draven, you are now... The cathedral doors exploded inward, not metaphorically. Actual explosion. Wood and iron and stone fragments spraying across the rear section of the hall. Screams erupted, witnesses scattered, braziers toppled, spilling fire across ancient floors. Through the smoke and chaos, armed men poured into the cathedral, dozens of them, professional soldiers wearing mixed armor that indicated mercenary companies rather than noble house forces. They moved with coordinated precision, surrounding exits, cutting off escape routes, establishing kill zones with practiced efficiency, and leading them. Standing in the shattered doorway, backlit by morning light and destruction, was Cassian Mordrell. He wasn't alone. Lord Thane stood beside him, and Lady Corrin, and representatives from House Vex, House Blackwell, House Sterling, 6 of the 15 noble families, half the cathedral's witnesses, all of them armed, all of them positioned to support the assault rather than defend against it.
Betrayal, Seraphine's mind screamed. Coalition uprising. They've been planning this,
waiting for the perfect moment when Vaelor would be distracted and vulnerable. The wedding. They attack during the wedding because it's the one moment the Duke can't be in full combat readiness without appearing paranoid. The one ceremony where tradition demands he present himself as leader rather than weapon. And they use that opening to strike. Vaelor's sword cleared its sheath before Seraphine finished processing what was happening. His guards moved into defensive formation around the platform, shields raised, weapons ready. But they were outnumbered 3-1, surrounded. Trapped in a cathedral that had been transformed into execution ground, Cassian stepped forward through the settling dust. He looked different. The charming negotiator had vanished. What remained was something colder, harder. A man who'd been playing a role and had finally discarded the mask. Duke Draven. How kind of you to gather everyone important in one location. Saved us considerable effort hunting down witnesses after we're finished with the primary objective. His voice echoed in the damaged cathedral. Several wounded witnesses moaned in the wreckage. Others lay silent, dead, killed by the initial blast or crushed by falling debris. Vaelor's expression didn't change. No panic, no fear, just cold assessment of battlefield conditions and available options. Cassian, I wondered how long you'd maintain the pretense of loyal opposition. This is rather direct for someone who usually prefers manipulating others into doing his violence. Oh, I tried manipulation. Spent months building coalition support, convincing noble families that distributed power serves everyone better than your concentrated tyranny. But you're stubborn. And your new bride proved surprisingly resistant to corruption despite her family's desperate circumstances. His eyes shifted to Seraphine. She felt the weight of his gaze like physical pressure. I offered you alternatives, Lady Vael. Warned you that loyalty to tyrants only lasts as long as you remain useful. You chose absolute commitment to Blackthorne instead. Unfortunate, because now you die alongside him rather than surviving to renegotiate your position under new management. The words landed like blades between her ribs. He tested her at the banquet, probed for weakness, found calculation and loyalty instead. So he'd marked her as threat requiring elimination rather than asset worth preserving. She'd sealed her own fate by defending Vaelor too convincingly. Lord Thane moved forward, warhammer resting on his shoulder. His expression carried none of the jovial merchant persona he'd worn during the banquet. This was the man beneath, the one who'd built fortunes on violence and strategic brutality. We tried legal methods, Draven, petitioned for power sharing, requested territorial redistribution. You refused every compromise. So we're implementing change through more direct means. Nothing personal, just political necessity. Nothing personal, Seraphine thought bitterly. They're murdering us and calling it political necessity. Dressing assassination in philosophical justification like that makes it legitimate. Lady Corin spoke next. Her voice carried the same cool calculation it had during their conversation at the banquet. The Northern Territories need leadership that governs through cooperation rather than fear. Coalition government, shared decision-making. You've had 300 years to prove Draven methods work. Time for alternatives. Vaelor laughed. The sound was cold, sharp, absolutely devoid of humor. Alternatives. You're offering alternatives by murdering me during my wedding ceremony and killing everyone who witnesses it. Very cooperative, such shared decision-making. I'm sure the surviving families will appreciate your philosophical approach to regime change. His guards tightened formation, shields locked, weapons ready, preparing for the inevitable assault. But everyone in the cathedral understood mathematics. 15 guards against 60 trained mercenaries backed by 6 noble houses meant only one outcome. Seraphine's mind raced through options. Exits blocked, outnumbered, surrounded. No reinforcements because half the noble families present were participating in the betrayal. This wasn't spontaneous uprising. This was coordinated assault planned months in advance. They'd waited for the wedding, for the moment when Vaelor would be distracted by ceremony and tradition. When his guard would be minimal because showing up to your own wedding with an army suggested paranoia that would alienate neutral families. Brilliant strategy, ruthless execution. Exactly the kind of calculated violence Vaelor himself would have employed if positions were reversed. The Duke's tactical training had been used against him, his own methods weaponized by enemies who'd studied his approach and found the gaps. Cassian drew his sword. The blade caught firelight from burning braziers. We'll make it quick. Professional. No torture, no prolonged suffering, just clean executions. You've earned that much respect through years of effective governance. Even tyrants deserve dignified deaths when they're competent tyrants. He gestured. Mercenaries advanced. Slow, controlled. Professional soldiers closing the kill zone with practiced precision. They weren't rushing, weren't reckless, just tightening the noose until escape became impossible. Vaelor's hand found Seraphine's wrist. His grip was iron, desperate in a way she'd never felt from him before. The man who governed through absolute certainty was finally confronting situation beyond his control. When they break our line, he said quietly, voice pitched for her ears only, run for the eastern passage. Behind the altar, secret exit. Guards know the route. Get to the war room. Burn the maps. Destroy the intelligence archives. Don't let them capture strategic documentation. His eyes locked onto hers. For the first time since they'd met, she saw something beyond cold calculation. Not warmth, but recognition of shared mortality. Acknowledgement that they were both about to die and the only question was whether they'd die with dignity or desperation. I'm sorry your survival required binding yourself to someone whose empire was already collapsing. You deserved better options. The words hit harder than any violence could have. Because beneath the tactical assessment and strategic positioning, Vaelor was revealing something fundamental. He'd known this was coming. Maybe not today. Maybe not during the wedding. But he'd known coalition forces were building toward open rebellion, and he'd married her anyway. Pulled her into this doomed situation because she represented strategic value worth the risk. Seraphine felt rage ignite in her chest. White hot. All-consuming. Not at the betrayers. At Vaelor. At the man who'd purchased her like livestock and bound her to a sinking ship without bothering to mention the hull was already taking water. You bastard. You knew. I suspected. There's a difference. You married me anyway. Made me swear absolute loyalty. Locked me into this fate knowing Blackthorne was vulnerable. I married you because I needed every possible advantage to hold the coalition together. Your family name. Your connection to Eastern Territories. The legitimacy your presence provided. I used you. That's what rulers do. Use available resources to extend survival even when ultimate victory becomes uncertain. The brutal honesty of it stole her breath. No apologies, no regret. Just cold acknowledgement that he'd sacrificed her to buy himself a few more months of power. The mercenaries were 10 feet away now, shields raised, weapons ready, seconds from contact. Vaelor released her wrist, drew a second blade from concealed sheath, turned toward the approaching soldiers with the calm certainty of someone who'd always known death would come violently and had made peace with that reality. Eastern Passage, he repeated. Run when the line breaks. That's an order. Seraphine looked at the altar. The passage he'd mentioned. Escape route that would save her life while he died buying time. She looked at the mercenaries. Professional killers doing a job. No hatred. No passion. Just hired violence executing contract terms. She looked at Cassian. At Lord Thane. At Lady Corrin. At the noble families who'd smiled during the banquet while planning murder. Who'd toasted alliances while funding rebellion. Who'd sworn loyalty while sharpening knives. And she understood something that changed everything. Running meant survival, but it meant surviving as victim, as someone who'd been used and discarded, someone who'd sworn absolute loyalty and then abandoned it the moment the oath became inconvenient. Running meant becoming exactly what her father had been, weak, self-serving, willing to sacrifice honor for continued existence. She'd spent 3 days learning to think like Blackthorne, to value results over sentiment, to understand that power came from ruthless commitment and unwavering purpose. Now the fortress was testing whether she'd actually absorbed those lessons, whether she'd meant the oath she'd sworn minutes ago or if it had been just words exchanged to secure temporary safety. Absolute loyalty, the priest's voice echoed in memory, above all other considerations including personal survival. She'd sworn it, bound herself to Blackthorne permanently, accepted the cage and the crown and everything that came with them. Now she had to prove she'd meant it. Seraphine's hand closed on a fallen guard sword. The weapon was heavy, unfamiliar. She'd never trained with blades, never fought in her life, had no idea how to properly hold the thing, much less use it against professional soldiers. Didn't matter. This wasn't about winning. This was about proving her oath had substance, that Lady Draven meant something beyond title and jewelry. Vaelor's eyes widened when he saw her raise the weapon. For the first time since they'd met, shock crossed his face. "What are you doing?" "Honoring my oath. I swore absolute loyalty." That includes the part about defending Draven interests above personal survival. You'll die, probably. But I'll die as Lady Draven instead of running as Seraphine Vael. There's a difference. Understanding flickered across Vaelor's expression. Not gratitude, but recognition. She'd just chosen him, chosen Blackthorne, chosen commitment to something larger than herself, even knowing it meant death. The Duke who'd governed through fear and absolute certainty had finally found someone loyal enough to die beside him. His hand found hers again. This time the grip wasn't desperate. It was acknowledgement, partnership forged in final moments. Then let's make them remember what it cost to betray Blackthorne. The mercenaries hit their defensive line like a wave against cliffs. Steel rang against steel. Men screamed. Blood sprayed across black marble floors. The cathedral transformed into abattoir as violence erupted with brutal intensity. Seraphine swung her sword wildly. No technique, no training, just desperate survival instinct channeled through unfamiliar weapon. The blade connected with something, a mercenary's arm. The impact jolted up her wrists. The man screamed, fell back. She'd hurt someone, actually damaged another human being through violence. The reality of it should have horrified her. Instead, she felt something colder settling into place. This was what Blackthorne demanded. This was what loyalty meant in environments where power determined survival. Become the weapon or become the victim. Those were the only options. Another mercenary came at her. She dodged. Too slow. His blade caught her shoulder. Pain exploded through her arm. Hot blood soaked through black silk. The dress that had seemed like armor was just fabric, useless against actual weapons. Vaelor killed the man before he could strike again. The Duke's blade moved with surgical precision. No wasted motion. Every strike calculated to maximize damage while minimizing exposure. He was magnificent and terrible. A weapon achieving its designed purpose. But there were too many. For every mercenary that fell, 2 more pressed forward. The defensive line was collapsing. Guards dying. The platform becoming islands surrounded by hostile forces. Lord Thane broke through. His warhammer swung toward Vaelor's head. The Duke blocked, but the impact drove him backward, off balance, vulnerable. Cassian moved in from the side, blade seeking the opening. This was it. The coordinated strike designed to kill. Seraphine threw herself between them. No thought, just instinct, just loyalty refined into action without consideration for consequences. Cassian's blade caught her instead of Vaelor. The steel punched through her side. Below ribs, deep, mortal. She felt the weapon tear through organs, felt blood flood into spaces it was never meant to reach. felt her body understanding that it was dying even as her mind struggled to process what had happened. The world tilted. Sound became distant. Vision narrowed to tunnel, showing Cassian's shocked expression. He'd meant to kill the Duke, hit the bride instead. Unplanned, unexpected. Wrong target. Seraphine fell. The marble floor rushed up to meet her. Impact jarred the blade deeper. More damage, more blood. Above her, Vaelor roared. The sound was inhuman, rage given voice. He killed Cassian with 3 strikes. Brutal, efficient. Reduced the man who'd orchestrated this betrayal to corpse in seconds. Then the Duke was kneeling, hands pressing against her wound, trying to stop bleeding that couldn't be stopped. His face filled her narrowing vision. For the first time, emotion cracked through his control. Not fear, but something rawer. Grief, maybe. Or recognition of something valuable being destroyed. You weren't supposed to do that. You were supposed to run. Seraphine tried to speak. Blood filled her mouth, made words impossible. She swallowed, tried again, swore absolute loyalty, meant it. Vaelor's hands shook. The man who'd executed nobles without trembling was shaking while holding his dying bride. I know you meant it. That's why this is... He stopped, couldn't finish. Around them, fighting continued. His remaining guards were dying. The cathedral was being overrun. Minutes remained before they'd both be killed. But Vaelor wasn't watching the battle anymore. He was watching Seraphine die. The bride who'd sworn absolute loyalty and proved it by sacrificing herself to protect him. She'd done it, proved her oath had substance, shown that Lady Draven meant something beyond political transaction, and the proof was killing her. Her vision was fading, darkness creeping in from edges, cold spreading through limbs that no longer responded to commands. This was death. Final. Absolute. The end of everything she'd tried to become. At least I died as something worth being, she thought. Not my father's daughter, not commodity sold to settle debts. Lady Draven. Someone who kept oaths even when they cost everything. Vaelor's face was still above her. She tried to memorize it. The harsh angles, the cold eyes that weren't cold anymore. The man who'd ruled through fear finally confronting the cost of that approach. They'd both die here. The ruthless Duke and the bride who'd proven herself worthy. Killed by coalition forces who'd weaponized his own methods against him. Poetic, maybe. Certainly final. Everything they'd built would collapse. Blackthorne would fall. New powers would rise. The cycle would continue without them. Her eyes closed. She couldn't keep them open anymore. The darkness was too heavy, too complete. This is how it ends, she thought. Dying on cathedral floor. Bleeding out while my husband watches. At least I proved I was worth keeping, even if he never gets the chance to actually keep me. But death didn't come. Instead, she felt movement. Being lifted. Vaelor carrying her, his voice cutting through the chaos with absolute authority. Eastern Passage. Now. Everyone who can still fight. We're leaving. Sounds of combat faded, replaced by footsteps. Running. Corridors. Secret routes through Blackthorne's ancient foundations. Seraphine drifted in and out. Consciousness became negotiable. Pain was constant but distant, like it was happening to someone else's body. She caught fragments. Vaelor barking orders. Aldrich's voice responding. Mira crying. Other voices she didn't recognize. They reached somewhere. A room. Medical equipment. Hands cutting away her ruined dress. Probing the wound. More pain. Distantly, she heard someone say the blade had missed vital organs by centimeters. Lucky. Survivable if treated immediately. But infection was guaranteed. Blood loss severe. Recovery uncertain. Seraphine let the darkness take her. She'd done everything required, sworn the oath, proved it meant something. Whether she survived to see consequences wasn't really relevant anymore. She'd become Lady Draven, committed absolutely, changed herself into whatever Blackthorne demanded. The fortress would decide if that was enough to deserve continued existence. Everything else was beyond her control. Seraphine woke to pain that felt like her entire body had been set on fire and then reconstructed incorrectly. Every breath drove shards of glass through her ribs. Every heartbeat sent fresh agony radiating from the wound in her side. The darkness that had claimed her was releasing its grip slowly, reluctantly, like it had expected to keep her permanently. Her eyes opened to unfamiliar stone ceiling. Not her chambers. Not the cathedral. Somewhere deeper. Older. The air tasted of earth and moisture and something metallic that might have been blood or might have been the residue of fear that had soaked into these walls over centuries. She tried to move. Her body refused. Muscles wouldn't respond. Everything felt disconnected, like her mind was sending commands to a corpse that hadn't realized it was supposed to be dead yet. A face appeared above her. Mira. The young woman's eyes were red from crying, but her hands were steady as she adjusted bandages wrapped around Seraphine's torso. "You're awake. That's good. The physician said you might not wake at all. Blood loss was severe. The blade went deep enough that infection is almost guaranteed. But you're fighting it, surviving when you shouldn't be able to." Mira's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd been working without rest. How long had Seraphine been unconscious? Hours? Days? Time felt negotiable in this place where darkness pressed against flickering torchlight like it was trying to reclaim territory stolen by fire. Seraphine tried to speak. Her throat was raw. Mouth tasted like copper and ash. She swallowed. Tried again. "Where?" "Underground. War room complex. Secret levels beneath Blackthorne's foundation. The Duke brought everyone who survived the cathedral attack here. 47 people. That's all that's left of Blackthorne's inner circle. Everyone else is dead or captured or fled to join the coalition. 47. Seraphine's mind struggled to process the number. Blackthorne had housed hundreds. Guards. Servants. Officials. Now reduced to 47 survivors hiding in tunnels beneath the fortress they'd once controlled. The coalition won. They owned the upper levels. 6 noble families declared the Duke dead and established provisional government. Lord Thane is calling himself Regent of the Northern Territories. Lady Corrin controls military operations. They're hunting for survivors to eliminate witnesses and secure their claim to power. Mira's hands kept working while she spoke, checking bandages, adjusting the rough blanket covering Seraphine's damaged body. Professional efficiency. Masking terror that leaked through in small tremors. "The Duke won't leave you. He's been here every hour when he's not planning counterattacks. Says you saved his life. Says loyalty that absolute deserves protection even when resources are limited and survival uncertain." Something in Seraphine's chest tightened. Not the wound. Something deeper. The ruthless Duke who'd reduced her to strategic asset was protecting her when abandoning the injured would have been tactically sound. When every resource mattered and dragging along dying weight decreased everyone's survival chances. He's changing the calculation, she realized, letting sentiment influence decisions. That's going to get him killed. Get everyone killed. Because weakness infects everything it touches, and Blackthorne's strength came from eliminating weakness without hesitation. But he won't leave me. Won't make the ruthless choice his methods demand. Because I proved my loyalty was absolute, and he's responding with protection that defies tactical reality. We're both fools, she thought bitterly. I'm dying for an oath that shouldn't have mattered. He's protecting me when he should be cutting losses. We've both let something beyond calculation corrupt our survival instincts. Footsteps echoed in the tunnel, heavy boots on stone. Seraphine recognized the rhythm. Vaelor moved with distinctive cadence, controlled, purposeful. Each step calculated even when exhausted or injured or watching his empire collapse into rubble. He entered the small chamber that served as medical space. His armor was damaged. Dented steel, dried blood. Evidence of fighting that had continued after carrying her to safety. His face carried exhaustion that went beyond physical. The kind that came from watching everything you'd built burn while desperately trying to save fragments from total annihilation. But when his eyes found Seraphine awake and conscious, something shifted. Not warmth exactly, but relief so profound it cracked through his control for a heartbeat before discipline reasserted itself. "You're alive." The physician said survival was unlikely. Too much blood loss. Too much trauma. But you're still fighting. His voice carried the same authority it always had, but underneath ran something raw. Emotion he couldn't quite suppress. The man who'd governed through fear was confronting the reality that someone had died for him. Almost died. Was still dying, maybe. All because of an oath he'd demanded and she'd actually meant. Seraphine forced words through her damaged throat. Status. Blackthorne. Coalition. Strategic position. Vaelor's expression hardened. Not at her. At the situation. At reality that had turned against them with brutal efficiency. Blackthorne Keep is occupied. Coalition forces control everything except these tunnels and the northern garrison. 6 noble families have declared me dead and established provisional government. They're executing anyone found loyal to Draven interests. Public displays, making examples to discourage resistance. He moved closer, knelt beside her so their faces were level. This close she could see the damage, bruises, cuts, evidence that he'd fought his way through multiple engagements while protecting survivors and carrying her dying body to safety. They're hunting us, systematically clearing the fortress. They know about the tunnels, but not all the entrances. We have maybe 48 hours before they find us. After that, we're trapped. No escape, no reinforcements, just slow death and darkness while they starve us out or flood these passages. The brutal honesty should have been terrifying. Instead, it clarified everything. They were losing. Blackthorne was falling. The Empire Vaelor had maintained through ruthlessness and absolute certainty was being dismantled by enemies who'd learned his methods and used them better. What's the plan? Vaelor's jaw tightened. For several seconds, he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decisions made in desperation. The northern garrison is still loyal, 300 soldiers under Commander Thorne. If we can reach them, we have fighting force capable of retaking Blackthorne. But the garrison is 2 days' march through hostile territory now, controlled by coalition forces. We'd need to move fast. Travel light. Leave behind anyone who can't keep pace. His eyes locked onto hers, making sure she understood what he was actually saying. Leave behind the wounded. Leave behind you. Because dragging dying bride through enemy territory guarantees capture and execution for everyone. The ruthless choice would be abandoning you here with enough supplies to last until you die naturally. Maximizes everyone else's survival chances. The words landed like blades. Clinical, tactical, exactly the kind of calculation Blackthorne demanded. Sacrifice the dying to save the living. Harsh mathematics that kept empires functioning when sentiment would have collapsed them. But Vaelor hadn't left her. Was sitting here explaining why he should abandon her instead of just doing it, which meant he was struggling with the decision, letting something beyond calculation influence him. Sentiment is weakness, his own philosophy whispered. Weakness gets everyone killed. Make the ruthless choice. Leave her. Save yourself and the soldiers who can still fight. Seraphine understood what was happening with painful clarity. She was the test. The measure of whether Vaelor could still make decisions based purely on strategic necessity or if something had changed. If her loyalty had infected him with the same commitment. If the oath she'd sworn had bound him as completely as it had bound her. Leave me, she said, voice stronger now despite the pain. Take everyone who can fight. Reach the garrison. Retake Blackthorne. My survival isn't strategically relevant. Prioritize the objective. Vaelor's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, not relief at being given permission to make the ruthless choice. Something darker. Conflict between what his methods demanded and what his instincts were screaming. He stood, turned away. Stood silent for so long, Seraphine thought he'd made the decision and was just delaying the words that would confirm her abandonment. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. No. The word hung in cold air. Defiant. Absolute. Wrong by every tactical standard that had kept Blackthorne standing for 300 years. Mira's eyes widened. Even she understood the implications. The Duke was refusing to make the ruthless choice, refusing to sacrifice dying asset to maximize everyone else's survival, refusing to follow his own methods when they demanded abandoning someone who'd proven their loyalty. Vaelor turned back. His face carried expression Seraphine had never seen before. Not surrender, but transformation. The ruthless Duke was choosing sentiment over tactics, loyalty over calculation, protecting what mattered to him even when it violated everything his empire had been built on. You swore absolute loyalty, proved it by sacrificing yourself to protect me. That oath runs both directions now. I won't abandon someone who died for Blackthorne. Won't leave you in darkness while I escape to safety. If we survive together. If we die together. That's how loyalty works when it's actually absolute instead of just strategically useful. The words rewrote everything. This wasn't the Duke who'd governed through fear. This was someone being forged in the crucible of losing everything. Someone discovering that power without loyalty was just tyranny waiting to collapse. That empires built purely on terror eventually fell because nobody would fight to preserve them when alternatives emerged. Seraphine felt something crack in her chest. Not the wound. Something deeper. The cold calculation that had kept her alive was being replaced by recognition that she mattered to him, not as strategic asset, as person, as partner, as someone worth protecting even when protection defied tactical reality. She'd changed him. Her sacrifice had infected the ruthless Duke with sentiment he'd spent lifetime eliminating, and that sentiment was going to get everyone killed because weakness didn't care about good intentions. It just consumed everything it touched, until nothing remained. They'd both die because neither could make the ruthless choice anymore. Mira cleared her throat. Her voice was small, but steady. There might be another option. Desperate. Probably suicidal. But possible. Vaelor's attention snapped to her. The girl who'd survived 7 years in Blackthorne by understanding when to speak and when silence served better. If she was volunteering strategy, it meant she'd seen something others had missed. Speak. The Eastern Garrison isn't the only force that matters. There are settlements throughout the territories. Mining communities, farming villages, lumber towns. People who've prospered under Draven protection. They don't love you, but they understand that coalition government means endless debate and political gridlock, means vulnerability to southern kingdoms who'll invade the moment they sense weakness. She moved to a rough table where maps had been spread, marked locations with trembling finger. If we send messengers to these settlements, make the case that Blackthorne's fall means their destruction. Rally local forces. We could assemble army larger than anything the garrison represents. Irregular troops, poorly trained, but numerous enough to matter if properly coordinated.
Vaelor studied the map. His eyes tracked the settlements, calculated distances, resources, response times. The strategic mind that had maintained empire for years was processing possibilities.
Messengers would be captured. Coalition controls roads. Communication is compromised. Not if we use the old smuggler routes. Tunnels and hidden paths the nobles don't know exist because they've never bothered learning how common people actually move through these territories. I grew up in mining settlement before entering service. I know the routes, know who to contact, know how to move unseen. The proposal was insane. Sending servants to rally civilian uprising against noble coalition, trusting that common people would risk everything to preserve Draven rule, despite having no particular love for the Duke who'd governed them through fear. But it was also brilliant, because Vaelor's methods had provided stability, protection, prosperity through ruthless enforcement of order. The coalition offered philosophy, shared governance, noble ideals that sounded wonderful until you remembered that peasants didn't care about political theory. They cared about food, safety, knowing that roads stayed clear and harvests stayed protected. Blackthorne had delivered those results through methods that terrified nobles but served common interests. The coalition had murdered their way to power and would now spend months debating how to actually govern while southern kingdoms prepared invasion forces. Seraphine watched Vaelor's face as he processed the strategy. Saw the moment decision crystallized. This wasn't about preserving his power anymore. This was about preventing collapse that would kill thousands when coalition government proved incapable of defending territories against external threats. How long to rally forces? 3 days if we move immediately. 5 days to assemble coordinated response. 7 days before we could march on Blackthorne with numbers large enough to matter. 7 days. Coalition would have found them long before that. Would have secured the fortress completely. Executed remaining loyalists. Established provisional government firmly enough that displacing them would require siege warfare. Vaelor's hand found his sword hilt, the unconscious gesture of man who'd solved every problem through violence and was about to do it again despite impossible odds. Then we don't hide for 7 days. We buy time. 47 survivors against coalition garrison. We make them fight for every tunnel, every chamber. Turn these passages into battlefield that cost them so much blood they hesitate. Make them cautious. Make them slow. Give the messengers time to reach settlements and rally support. He turned to face the survivors who'd crowded into the chamber. Soldiers, servants, officials, people who'd fled the cathedral massacre and followed him into darkness because alternatives meant certain death. We're not running. We're not surrendering. We're making the coalition pay for betraying Blackthorne. They think they won. They're wrong. They won the first battle. But wars aren't decided by initial victories. They're decided by who has commitment to keep fighting when survival becomes uncertain. His voice carried absolute authority, the same tone that had governed territories through fear now being channeled into different purpose.
not domination. Liberation.
Fighting to preserve something that served people beyond himself. This isn't about preserving my power. This is about preventing collapse that kills thousands. Coalition government can't defend these territories. Southern kingdoms will invade within months. Settlements will burn. Trade routes will fail. Everything we've built over generations will disappear because nobles wanted distributed authority without understanding that shared power means shared weakness. He drew his sword. The blade caught torchlight like captured lightning. So we fight. We make them remember why Blackthorne stood for 300 years. Not because Draven bloodline was special, but because ruthless commitment to protecting what matters works better than noble philosophy. We fight dirty. We fight smart. We fight until relief arrives, or we die trying. Those are the only options. Silence filled the chamber. Then slowly, one by one, survivors raised weapons, or fists, or whatever they had. Agreement forged not from loyalty to the Duke, but from understanding that he was right. Coalition collapse meant death for everyone. Fighting meant slim chance of survival. Mathematics favored commitment over surrender. Mira stepped forward. I'll lead the messenger team. I know the routes, know the contacts. I'll bring back army, or I'll die trying. Vaelor studied her. The girl who'd been 13 when she entered service. Who'd survived 7 years through understanding Blackthorne's brutal requirements. Who was now volunteering for mission that probably meant death even if successful. You understand what you're offering. Coalition forces will hunt you, torture you for information if captured. Death would be merciful compared to what they'd do.
I understand, but I also understand that running means dying slowly while the world burns. Fighting means maybe dying with purpose. I'll take purpose over safety. The Duke nodded once. Sharp.
Decisive. Accepting sacrifice from someone whose loyalty he'd earned through results rather than fear. Take 10 people. Fastest runners. Best wilderness survival skills. Move tonight. Use darkness for cover. Don't stop. Don't look back. Just reach the settlements and make them understand what's at stake. Mira turned to Seraphine. Their eyes met. Understanding passed between them. Two women who'd survived Blackthorne by becoming harder than stone. Who'd learned that sentiment was luxury that got people killed, who were now choosing loyalty and purpose over calculated self-interest. Stay alive, Lady Draven. The Duke needs someone worth protecting. Give him reason to keep fighting when the odds turn impossible. She left. 10 survivors followed. Their footsteps faded into tunnel darkness. Mission launched that would determine whether Blackthorne survived or collapsed into history, as cautionary tale about empires built on fear. Vaelor returned to Seraphine's side, knelt again. His hand found hers, rough fingers closing around her smaller hand with gentleness that seemed impossible from someone capable of such violence. 7 days. That's how long we need to survive. Can you do that? Can you stay alive while I'm turning these tunnels into nightmare that makes coalition forces hesitate long enough for relief to arrive? Seraphine looked at him, really looked, saw past the ruthless Duke to the man beneath. Someone who'd governed through fear because sentiment had been beaten out of him by years of betrayal and violence. Someone who'd finally found loyalty absolute enough to trust. Someone who was choosing to protect her even when tactics demanded abandonment. He'd changed. She'd changed him. Her sacrifice had cracked the armor he'd built around himself. Now he was fighting not just for power, but for something larger, for proving that loyalty mattered. That commitment beyond self-interest could actually work. 7 days, she confirmed, voice steady despite pain. I'll stay alive, but you need to promise something in return. What? When this is over. When we've retaken Blackthorne or died trying. No more treating me like strategic asset. No more calculations about whether I'm useful enough to protect. I'm your partner, your equal. Lady Draven in truth instead of just title. That's the price for my survival. Vaelor's eyes searched hers, looking for deception, testing whether she was serious, finding only determination backed by someone who'd already died once for him and wasn't afraid to do it again. His lips curved. Not quite smile, but acknowledgement. Deal. You survive 7 days. I'll give you empire to rule beside me. Equal partner, equal authority, equal danger. Everything Blackthorne becomes moving forward, we build together. He stood, turned to the remaining survivors. Prepare defensive positions, set traps in the outer tunnels, barricade critical passages. When coalition forces come, and they will come, we make them bleed for every foot of ground. We're not defending anymore. We're attacking. Aggressive defense that costs them so much blood. They start questioning whether eliminating us is worth the casualties. The survivors moved. Soldiers began organizing defensive positions. Others started preparing supplies. Everyone understanding that next 7 days would determine whether Blackthorne endured or disappeared. Vaelor lingered beside Seraphine a moment longer. I won't leave you. I know tactics demand it. I know ruthless choice would be abandoning you here to maximize everyone else's survival. But I'm done making ruthless choices that hollow me out until nothing remains except violence and calculation. You showed me loyalty can be absolute. Now I'm showing you protection can be equally absolute. We survive together or we don't survive. But we face whatever comes as partners instead of ruler and possession. He left to coordinate defenses. Seraphine lay in darkness listening to sounds of preparation. Metal being sharpened, barricades constructed, traps set. 47 people preparing to make last stand in tunnels beneath fortress they'd once controlled. The pain in her side was constant. Infection was spreading. She could feel it. Fever building. Body fighting battle it would probably lose. 7 days felt impossible. 7 hours seemed optimistic. But she'd promised, sworn she'd stay alive while Vaelor bought time for relief that might never arrive. So she'd fight. She'd survive through determination and spite, an absolute refusal to die before seeing whether her sacrifice had meant something beyond temporary gesture. Outside the medical chamber, coalition forces were searching, getting closer, following tunnel networks with systematic precision. Soon they'd find the survivors. Soon fighting would begin. And then the real test would start. Whether 47 desperate people could hold against hundreds. Whether ruthless tactics could overcome overwhelming numbers. Whether loyalty and commitment actually mattered when mathematics favored the enemy. Seraphine closed her eyes. Conserved energy. Let her body focus on healing instead of consciousness. She'd need every scrap of strength for what was coming. 7 days. 7 days to prove that Blackthorne meant something beyond fear. That Draven rule had substance worth preserving. That empires could be built on loyalty instead of just terror. 7 days to survive or die trying. The tunnels held their breath, waiting, knowing that violence was coming and nothing could prevent it. Only question was whether anyone would survive what came next.
Hours passed. Seraphine drifted between consciousness and darkness. Pain was constant companion. Fever built slowly. Her body was losing the battle against infection.
Time was running out faster than 7 days. Maybe faster than 7 hours. Shouts echoed through tunnels. Distant, getting closer. Coalition forces had found an entrance. Were pushing deeper. The defense was beginning. Sounds of combat filtered through stone. Steel on steel. Screams. Explosions from traps being triggered. Vaelor's voice cutting through chaos with commands that turned desperate survivors into coordinated resistance. The fighting grew closer, louder, more intense. Coalition forces were pressing hard, trying to overwhelm defenses through numerical superiority. Seraphine forced herself to sitting position. Agony screamed through her side. Didn't matter, she wouldn't die lying down. Wouldn't let Coalition find her helpless if they broke through. A guard rushed into the medical chamber. His armor was bloody, face carried terror barely contained. They're breaking through. Western tunnel collapsed. Eastern barricade is failing. The Duke ordered evacuation to deeper levels, but there's nowhere left to retreat. We're trapped. The words confirmed what Seraphine had known. They were losing. 47 survivors couldn't hold against hundreds. Mathematics was asserting itself. Time was running out. Vaelor appeared in the doorway. His armor was destroyed. Blood covered him, his own and others. The ruthless Duke looked like he'd walked through hell and brought pieces of it back. But his eyes were still fierce, still fighting, still refusing to surrender despite odds that had turned impossible. We're out of time. Coalition forces are everywhere. They'll breach this chamber within minutes. His gaze locked onto Seraphine. In that look, she saw everything. Apology for bringing her into this. Admiration for her loyalty. Grief that protection wasn't enough to save her. Determination to die fighting rather than surrender. I'm sorry. I promised 7 days. We barely made 7 hours. Seraphine forced herself to stand. Legs trembled. Wound tore open fresh. Blood soaked through bandages. Didn't matter. She was Lady Draven. She'd die on her feet. Then we make the last hours count. We show them why Blackthorne stood for 300 years. Not through fear, through commitment that doesn't break even when everything else does. Vaelor's expression transformed, pride maybe, or recognition that he'd finally found someone who matched his intensity, who understood that some things were worth dying for even when survival became impossible. He drew his sword. She grabbed fallen blade from dead guard. They stood together, partners, equals. Everything Blackthorne had become compressed into final stand. The coalition forces were coming, breaking through final defenses, flooding into the chamber with overwhelming numbers. This was it. The end. Final moments before everything collapsed, Vaelor's hand found hers, squeezed once. Together. Together, she confirmed. The enemy poured through the breach, dozens, hundreds, unstoppable tide of violence, and Blackthorne's last defenders charged to meet them. Steel met steel in darkness that had witnessed 3 centuries of Draven violence. Seraphine's blade connected with coalition soldiers' armor hard enough to jar her wrists. The impact tore fresh agony through her wounded side. Blood soaked through bandages. Her vision swam with black spots. None of it mattered. She was Lady Draven. She'd die fighting. Beside her, Vaelor moved like incarnate death. Every strike calculated to kill. No wasted motion. The ruthless Duke had been reduced to basics: survive, protect, destroy anything threatening what remained of Blackthorne. His sword carved through enemies with mechanical precision. Men fell, screamed, died in tunnels that would become their tomb. But there were too many. Always too many. For every coalition soldier that dropped, 3 more pressed forward. The mathematics were brutal. 47 defenders against hundreds. Exhaustion versus fresh troops. Dying bride and desperate duke against organized military force. This is how it ends, Seraphine thought through the haze of pain and fever, fighting in darkness beneath the fortress we couldn't hold. Dying together, because neither of us could make the ruthless choice anymore. At least we proved loyalty meant something. At least we died as partners instead of ruler and possession. A blade caught her leg. She went down. Impact drove air from lungs. Her own sword clattered away into darkness. Above her, coalition soldiers raised weapons for killing strikes. Vaelor was there before the blades fell, his body covering hers. Shield raised, taking impacts meant for her, protecting dying bride when tactics demanded letting her die so he could escape. The ruthless Duke had been infected completely by sentiment, would die because loyalty mattered more than survival. They'd both failed. Failed to be ruthless enough. Failed to make calculations that kept empires standing. Failed to sacrifice what needed sacrificing. But they'd succeeded at something else. Something harder. They'd proven that commitment beyond self-interest could exist. That oaths could have substance. That 2 people could choose each other even when choosing meant death. Maybe that was worth dying for. Maybe transformation from tyrant and possession into partners facing end together meant something. Maybe Blackthorne's legacy wasn't the empire, but the lesson that loyalty refined until it became absolute changed everything it touched. The coalition soldiers pressed closer. This was it. Final seconds. Vaelor's shield was breaking. His sword arm was failing. They were out of time, out of options, out of everything except commitment to die together. Then the world exploded. Not metaphorically. Actual explosions. The tunnel walls shattered. Stone and fire and violence erupting from multiple directions simultaneously. Coalition soldiers were thrown backward, crushed, burned, destroyed by blasts that turned ordered assault into chaos. Through the smoke and destruction, new figures emerged. Not coalition forces. Something else. Miners carrying pickaxes. Farmers with scythes. Lumber workers wielding axes, hundreds of them. Thousands. Common people flooding into tunnels wearing improvised armor and carrying whatever weapons they'd been able to grab. And leading them, covered in dust and exhaustion, but very much alive, was Mira. The girl who'd promised to bring back army or die trying had delivered. She'd reached the settlements, made the case that Blackthorne's fall meant their destruction, rallied forces nobody had expected because nobles never considered that common people might actually fight to preserve Draven rule. But here they were, pouring into the tunnels, attacking coalition forces from behind, turning certain defeat into chaos that gave defenders breathing room. Seraphine watched through vision narrowing from blood loss and shock. This wasn't possible. Mira had left 7 hours ago. The settlements were days away. There wasn't time to rally this many people. Wasn't time to march them back. The mathematics didn't work, unless she'd been preparing them before she ever left. Unless messengers had been sent days ago. Unless Mira had been planning this contingency from the moment Coalition attacked the cathedral, the girl who'd survived 7 years in Blackthorne by understanding when to speak had apparently also learned when to act without orders, had seen the strategic necessity of rallying common people, had moved pieces into position while chaos consumed leadership. She'd saved them, saved Blackthorne, saved the Duke and his dying bride through initiative and courage that went beyond any oath or command. Coalition forces were breaking, retreating, overwhelmed by numbers they'd never anticipated. The tunnels that had been trapped were now becoming Coalition nightmare. Miners who knew every passage, farmers who'd spent lifetimes working in darkness, common people fighting with desperate intensity because they understood that Coalition government meant vulnerability their families couldn't survive. Vaelor lifted Seraphine carefully. His hands trembled. The ruthless Duke who'd governed through absolute certainty was shaking while holding dying bride he'd protected beyond all tactical reason. "Stay with me." Relief arrived. "We won. Just stay alive long enough to see it." His voice carried desperation that shattered her heart. The man who'd eliminated weakness without hesitation was begging her not to die, pleading with someone who'd already given everything to hold on just a little longer. Seraphine tried to answer. Her throat wouldn't work. Too much blood, too much damage. Her body had fought past its limits, was shutting down despite mind screaming to keep functioning. This was it. Real death. Final. Coming for her despite relief arriving, despite victory snatched from defeat. She'd survived the cathedral attack only to die in tunnels beneath Blackthorne, would never see the fortress retaken, never witness whether transformation she'd sparked in Vaelor actually changed how he ruled. Never know if their partnership meant anything beyond final gesture. At least I proved loyalty was real, she thought as darkness closed in. At least I changed him enough that he'll remember. At least Blackthorne survives even if I don't. Her eyes closed. Couldn't keep them open anymore. The darkness was too heavy, too complete, too final. Vaelor's voice was distant now, calling her name, ordering her to stay conscious. Commands from Duke to subject. Desperate pleas from partner to partner. Neither worked. She was already gone, already dying, already becoming ghost story about bride who'd sworn absolute loyalty and meant it. The last thing she felt was his hands holding her, refusing to let go. The ruthless Duke clinging to dying wife like she was only thing in world that mattered. Then nothing. Darkness took her completely. Seraphine woke to silence. Not the oppressive quiet of tunnels. Something different, peaceful. The kind of silence that came from safety rather than hiding. Her eyes opened slowly, expecting stone ceiling and torchlight, finding instead familiar view. Her chambers in Blackthorne, the south wing overlooking eastern valleys. Morning light streaming through windows that had been cleaned, walls that showed no damage. Everything pristine, restored, like the cathedral attack had never happened, like Coalition uprising had been nightmare rather than reality. But the pain in her side was real. The bandages wrapped around her torso were real. The weakness in her limbs and fever in her blood were real. This wasn't dream. This was aftermath. She'd survived. Somehow. Against odds that should have killed her multiple times. She was alive. In her chambers. In Blackthorne that had apparently been retaken. How long had she been unconscious? Days? Weeks? Time felt negotiable when you'd been dying. The door opened. Mira entered carrying tray. The girl looked exhausted but whole. Alive. Victorious in ways that went beyond simple survival. When she saw Seraphine awake, relief flooded her expression, followed immediately by something else. Respect. The kind given to equals rather than superiors. Lady Draven, you're finally conscious. The physician said you might never wake. Infection was severe. Blood loss critical. You've been hovering between life and death for 3 weeks. But you're fighting. Still fighting. Just like you fought in the cathedral. Just like you fought in the tunnels. 3 weeks. Seraphine's mind struggled to process the time frame. 3 weeks unconscious while world continued without her. 3 weeks of missing everything that happened after relief arrived. What happened? Blackthorne. Coalition. Vaelor. Mira set the tray down carefully, began checking bandages with practiced efficiency. We won. The common forces I rallied broke Coalition assault in the tunnels, drove them back into the upper fortress. 3 days of brutal fighting, room by room, corridor by corridor, making them pay for every inch of ground. By the time it ended, coalition leadership was dead or captured. Lord Thane fell defending the Great Hall. Lady Corrin was executed for treason. The other noble families surrendered when they realized the Duke had support they'd never anticipated. She paused, fingers gentle on infected wound. The common people surprised everyone. They fought harder than noble soldiers, more committed, more vicious, because they understood that coalition government meant instability. Their families couldn't survive. They weren't fighting for the Duke. They were fighting for themselves. For protection and prosperity Blackthorne had provided through methods nobles found distasteful, but peasants found effective. Seraphine absorbed the information, processing implications. The empire had survived, had been preserved not by Vaelor's ruthlessness, but by common people choosing stability over noble philosophy, choosing results over ideals, choosing Draven rule because it worked even when it was harsh. Everything Vaelor had built had been validated, not through fear, through delivery of outcomes that mattered to people whose survival depended on effective governance rather than elegant theory. And Vaelor? Is he, alive? Injured? Exhausted? Changed? Mira's eyes carried knowledge that went beyond simple observation. He's been here every day, sometimes multiple times, watching you fight infection, watching you survive when physicians said you wouldn't. He doesn't speak much anymore, just sits beside you, holds your hand, waits. Changed, Mira had said. The word carried weight. Transformation beyond tactical adjustment, fundamental shift in how the ruthless Duke approached everything. How has he changed? Mira considered her words carefully, looking for truth rather than comfort. He's softer, not weak, but different. He still makes hard decisions, still governs with discipline. But there's something else now. Consideration, maybe. Understanding that loyalty runs both directions, that protection matters as much as domination. That empire built purely on fear eventually collapses because nobody fights to preserve it. She finished checking bandages, stepped back. You changed him, Lady Draven. Your sacrifice showed him that absolute loyalty could exist, that someone could choose him not from fear, but from genuine commitment. That partnership might actually work better than possession. He's building something different now. Still Blackthorne, still ruthless when necessary, Osman, but tempered by understanding that strength includes protecting what matters instead of just destroying what threatens. The words painted picture of transformation Seraphine had sparked but never witnessed. She'd changed the ruthless Duke, infected him with sentiment he'd spent lifetime eliminating. And instead of making him weak, it had made him something more dangerous. A ruler who governed through discipline backed by loyalty, rather than just terror backed by violence. Blackthorne would be different. Harder in some ways, softer in others. Empire built on results and protection rather than just fear and domination. Better maybe, if it lasted. If transformation proved sustainable rather than temporary sentiment that would fade when memory of her sacrifice dimmed. I want to see him. Mira nodded. I'll let him know you're conscious. He's in the war room. Always in the war room. Rebuilding systems. Restructuring alliances, making sure coalition collapse doesn't create vacuum that invites external threats. She left. Seraphine lay in morning light feeling her body's damage inventory itself. The wound was healing, slowly. Infection was retreating. She'd survive. Would carry scars, would never be fully whole. But she'd live. The door opened again. Vaelor entered. He looked different, thinner, harder. Like 3 weeks of brutal fighting and desperate defense had burned away everything except core essentials. His armor was gone. He wore simple clothing, black, practical, leader rather than weapon. But his eyes were the same, that same cold calculation, that same ruthless assessment, measuring her condition, determining survival probability, always thinking, always calculating. Then he saw her awake and conscious, and everything changed. The cold calculation shattered. What remained was raw relief so profound it cracked through every defense he'd built around himself. You're alive. The physician said you'd die. Said infection was too severe. Blood loss too critical. Said you'd fought past human limits and your body would surrender eventually. But you're still here, still fighting, still refusing to quit. He moved to her bedside, knelt the way he had in the tunnels. The ruthless Duke, reducing himself to her level rather than standing above. Partner instead of ruler. 3 weeks I've watched you hover between life and death. 3 weeks wondering if your sacrifice would be rewarded with survival, or if I'd lose you after everything you'd given. 3 weeks confronting the reality that loyalty, absolute enough to die for, might not be enough to live for. His hand found hers, rough fingers closing around her smaller hand with gentleness that seemed impossible from someone capable of such violence. I made mistakes. Used you. Reduced you to strategic asset. Married you to secure territorial advantage without considering that you might actually matter beyond tactical positioning. That was wrong. Ruthless, but wrong. Effective, but hollow. Everything I'd built was hollow because it lacked what you brought. Loyalty that wasn't transactional. Commitment that wasn't calculated. Partnership that actually meant something. Seraphine watched him speak. Watched the ruthless Duke expose vulnerability she'd never expected to see. This was confession. Acknowledgement of failure. Recognition that methods that had sustained empire for 300 years had nearly destroyed everything because they eliminated the exact loyalty that made empires worth preserving. What changed? Vaelor's jaw tightened. For several seconds, he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried weight of decisions made in darkness. Watching you die changed everything. Seeing someone sacrifice themselves not from fear, but from genuine loyalty. Understanding that I'd spent lifetime eliminating the exact commitment I needed most. I'd built empire on terror and called it strength. You showed me real strength was choosing loyalty even when it cost everything. He stood, moved to the window, stared out at territories he'd nearly lost, at valleys and mountains and settlements that had rallied to preserve Blackthorne, not because they feared him, but because his methods delivered results they needed. The common people fought harder than noble soldiers. Did Mira tell you that? Peasants and miners and farmers? They fought like demons to preserve Draven rule. Not because they love me, because they understand that stability matters more than philosophy, that effective governance beats elegant theory, that sometimes ruthlessness serves greater good even when it violates noble sensibilities. He turned back to face her. But they also fought because you'd shown them something. Lady who'd married Duke for strategic reasons but proved loyalty went beyond transaction. Woman who'd sacrificed herself to protect husband who'd treated her as possession. That story spread through the settlements, became legend, made you symbol of commitment they could understand and respect. You didn't save Blackthorne through violence. You saved it by proving loyalty could be absolute. The words landed with weight of truth she'd never considered. Her sacrifice had rippled beyond immediate tactical impact, had become story that rallied forces nobody expected, had transformed her from strategic asset into symbol that common people could believe in. She changed Blackthorne not through calculation, but through commitment, had proven that oaths could have substance, that partnership could exist even in environments built on terror, that empires could be preserved through loyalty as much as fear. What happens now? Vaelor returned to her bedside. His expression carried determination forged through crisis. Now we rebuild. Restructure Blackthorne to incorporate lessons learned, maintain discipline and ruthless enforcement of order, but temper it with understanding that loyalty requires reciprocation. That protection matters as much as domination. That empire built on fear alone eventually falls, but empire built on results and commitment can endure. He took her hand again, and we rule together. Equal partners, equal authority, equal responsibility. You wanted that, demanded it as price for survival. I'm giving it. Not because you forced me, but because you've earned it. Proved yourself capable, worthy, strong enough to stand beside me without flinching. His eyes locked onto hers. Lady Seraphine Draven. Will you help me build something better than what came before? Something that maintains Blackthorne's strength while acknowledging that loyalty runs both directions? Something ruthless when necessary, but tempered by understanding that people matter beyond their tactical positioning? The question hung in morning light, offering not just partnership but transformation. Chance to rebuild empire into something that incorporated hard lessons from near destruction. Opportunity to prove that ruthless methods and genuine loyalty could coexist. Seraphine studied him, really studied, saw past the ruthless Duke to the man beneath, someone who'd governed through fear because it worked, who'd eliminated sentiment because it complicated calculations, who'd nearly lost everything because methods that sustained empire couldn't inspire loyalty worth dying for. He was offering change, real change, Not abandoning discipline or ruthlessness, but incorporating recognition that strength included protection. That power without loyalty was just tyranny waiting to collapse. It was everything she'd wanted, everything she'd fought for: partnership, equality. Chance to shape Blackthorne into something that delivered results without hollowing out everyone it touched. But accepting meant committing fully, meant becoming ruler herself, meant making hard decisions that would cost lives and test whether her loyalty could survive transitioning from sacrifice to authority, meant discovering if she could actually govern with same ruthless clarity Vaelor demanded while maintaining humanity that had saved them both. Could she do that? Could she become Lady Draven in truth? Could she rule beside man who'd purchased her like livestock and discovered partnership only after watching her nearly die? She thought about her father, weak, delusional, destroyed by believing sentiment alone could sustain nobility. She'd spent lifetime watching his failures, learning what didn't work. She thought about the cathedral, swearing absolute loyalty, meaning it, proving it by taking blade meant for Vaelor, discovering that commitment beyond calculation could actually matter. She thought about the tunnels, fighting beside him, dying beside him, choosing partnership over survival because some things were worth dying for. She'd already made this choice. Multiple times. In multiple ways. Every sacrifice had been affirmation that she believed in something larger than self-preservation. That loyalty could have substance. That oaths could be absolute. Now Vaelor was offering chance to make that commitment permanent, to rule instead of just survive, to build instead of just endure. The answer was obvious. Had always been obvious. From the moment she'd stepped between Cassian's blade and Vaelor's life. From the moment she'd refused to run when the tunnels were overrun. From the moment she'd chosen him despite every tactical reason to choose differently. Yes, I'll help you build something better. Equal partners, equal authority, equal danger. Everything Blackthorne becomes moving forward, we build together. Vaelor's expression transformed. Relief, gratitude, something deeper that might have been love if the ruthless Duke still knew how to feel emotions beyond calculation. He leaned down, kissed her forehead, gentle, reverent. Touch of someone handling something precious rather than possessing something owned. Then let's get started. Blackthorne needs rebuilding. Noble families need reminding that betrayal costs everything. Common people need reassurance that stability they fought for will be maintained. And you need healing, full recovery, strength to stand beside me when we face whatever comes next. He straightened, commander returning, leader preparing to govern, but paused at the door, looked back. Thank you. For not running, for not abandoning me when tactics demanded it, for proving that loyalty absolute enough to die for actually exists. You saved more than my life. You saved my understanding of what makes empire worth preserving. He left, returned to war room and endless work of rebuilding power structure. Seraphine lay in morning light, feeling transformation settle into her bones. She wasn't possession anymore, wasn't commodity, wasn't strategic asset. She was Lady Draven, partner, equal, someone who'd earned position through loyalty rather than transaction, someone who'd changed ruthless Duke into something more dangerous, a ruler who governed through discipline backed by genuine commitment. Together they'd rebuild Blackthorne, maintain ruthlessness when necessary, temper it with protection when possible, create empire that delivered results without hollowing out everyone it touched, build something that could endure because it was worth preserving instead of just feared into existence. It wouldn't be easy. Would require constant balance between strength and sentiment, between ruthless enforcement and genuine loyalty, between methods that worked and methods that cost everything they protected. But Seraphine had survived impossible odds multiple times, had changed ruthless Duke through sacrifice, had rallied common people through commitment, had proven that partnership could exist even in environments built on terror. She could do this, could rule beside Vaelor, could help build something better than what came before. The weeks passed. Seraphine healed slowly, infection retreated, strength returned. Scars formed over wounds that would never fully close. But she survived, became stronger, transformed from dying bride into recovering partner. Vaelor visited daily, sometimes multiple times. They spoke about governance, territory management, how to restructure noble alliances, how to maintain common support, how to balance ruthlessness with protection. Each conversation was education and partnership, teaching and learning simultaneously.
Mira attended constantly. The girl who'd rallied common forces had been elevated, promoted to chief of intelligence, given authority and resources.
Recognition that initiative and courage mattered as much as noble bloodline. Within 2 months, Seraphine was walking, slowly, painfully, but moving, reclaiming body that had nearly died multiple times, proving recovery was possible even when odds favored continued decline. Within 3 months, she was attending council meetings, sitting beside Vaelor, offering perspectives on territorial disputes and resource allocation, learning governance through immersion, making mistakes, correcting them, growing into roles she'd claimed through sacrifice. The noble families watched cautiously, testing whether Lady Draven's authority was real or ceremonial, whether Duke would actually share power or if partnership was temporary sentiment that would fade. Seraphine proved it was real, made decisions that affected thousands, overruled Vaelor when necessary, stood her ground when challenged, demonstrated that equal partnership meant actual equality. Some nobles resented it, whispered that Peasant Bride had corrupted Duke's ruthlessness, that Blackthorne was weakening through sentiment. That coalition had been right about distributed power. Those whispers ended when Vaelor executed 3 nobles for attempting minor rebellion. Public, brutal. Reminder that ruthlessness hadn't disappeared, had just been refined, tempered but not eliminated. The common people celebrated, not the executions, the partnership. Duke who'd governed through fear had found Lady Worth standing beside. Woman who'd sacrificed herself had survived to rule. Together, they were building something that delivered stability without requiring constant terror. Empire that protected as much as it dominated. Spring arrived. Snow melted from valleys. Trade routes reopened. Settlements prospered. Blackthorne stood stronger than before because foundation had been rebuilt. Not just through fear, through loyalty proven absolute, through partnership forged in crisis, through understanding that strength included protection. 6 months after the cathedral attack, Seraphine stood on the high balcony overlooking Blackthorne's endless territories. Vaelor beside her, equal rulers watching empire they'd nearly lost. Empire they'd rebuilt together. The scars from her wound were permanent, would ache in cold weather, would remind her daily of blade that had nearly killed her, of sacrifice that had changed everything. But scars were proof of survival, evidence that she'd fought impossible odds and won, marks that transformed her from victim into warrior, from possession into partner, from commodity into queen. Vaelor's hand found hers, rough fingers intertwining with hers, partnership expressed through simple gesture. We did it. Survived. Rebuilt. Created something worth preserving. Empire that delivers results and earns loyalty instead of just demanding it through terror. Seraphine looked at the valleys below, at settlements flying Draven banners not from fear but from choice, at trade routes protected not just by violence but by commitment to maintaining prosperity, at empire transformed through crisis into something harder and softer simultaneously. We did. Together. Equal partners. Equal authority. Equal scars. She turned to face him. The ruthless Duke who'd purchased her like livestock, who'd discovered partnership only after watching her nearly die, who'd been changed by loyalty he'd never expected to encounter. He was still ruthless, still calculated, still made hard decisions that cost lives, but tempered now by understanding that people mattered, that loyalty required reciprocation, that empire built purely on fear eventually collapsed because nobody would fight to preserve it. He'd become better ruler, not softer, but more complete. Methods that worked backed by commitment that inspired. Discipline that maintained order, tempered by protection that earned loyalty. And beside him stood woman who'd transformed from desperate daughter into lady capable of ruling empire. Who'd learned ruthlessness without losing humanity. Who'd proven that loyalty could be absolute without being blind. Who'd survived impossible odds and emerged stronger for the breaking. Together they were dangerous, powerful, capable of maintaining Blackthorne through whatever came next. Not because they were perfect, but because they'd been tested beyond destruction and discovered partnership forged in crisis couldn't be easily broken. Vaelor pulled her closer. She leaned into him. 2 people who'd chosen each other despite every reason to choose differently. 2 rulers who'd rebuilt empire into something worth the sacrifice it had cost. Below them, Blackthorne breathed. Ancient fortress that had stood for 3 centuries. that had survived coalition uprising and near destruction, that had been transformed through crisis into something that could endure not just through fear, but through loyalty, proven absolute. The empire would face threats. Southern kingdoms would test borders. Noble families would scheme. Challenges would emerge that tested whether partnership could survive transitioning from desperate survival into actual governance. But Seraphine and Vaelor would face them together, equal partners, equal rulers, two people who discovered that strength included protection, that ruthlessness could coexist with loyalty, that empires built on results and commitment endured longer than those built purely on terror. They'd survived the cathedral massacre, survived the tunnel fighting, survived infection and blood loss and odds that should have killed them both. They'd survive whatever came next, not because they were invincible, but because they'd learned the lesson that saved empires. Loyalty mattered. Partnership worked. Commitment beyond calculation could actually sustain power better than fear alone. Blackthorne would stand. Not forever. Nothing lasted forever. But longer because two rulers had been tested beyond breaking and discovered they were stronger together than apart. Longer because common people had something worth fighting for instead of just something to fear. Longer because ruthless methods had been tempered by recognition that protecting what mattered served better than just destroying what threatened. The sun set over northern territories, painting mountains gold and valleys crimson, light and shadow playing across landscape that had witnessed centuries of Draven rule, that would witness more, that would remember this moment when everything changed, when ruthless Duke and loyal lady rebuilt empire into something that could endure, not through fear alone, but through partnership, through commitment, through understanding that real strength included protecting what you claimed to rule. Seraphine felt Vaelor's arms around her, felt the empire breathing below them, felt scars that marked her survival and transformation, felt certainty settling into bones that had been broken and healed stronger. This was her life now. Her empire, her partner, her choice made absolute through sacrifice and validated through survival. She'd been purchased like livestock, had transformed herself into weapon through loyalty, had become partner through sacrifice, had risen to rule through commitment that couldn't be broken by odds that should have destroyed her. Lady Seraphine Draven stood beside Duke Vaelor Draven, watching empire they'd rebuilt together. Equal rulers, equal partners, equal scars. Two people who'd chosen each other when choosing meant death and discovered that surviving together meant building something worth the sacrifice. Blackthorne would endure. The ruthless Duke and loyal lady would ensure it, not through terror alone, but through methods that worked backed by commitment that inspired, through discipline tempered by protection, through partnership forged in crisis and proven absolute through sacrifice. This was their empire now, built from ruins of near destruction, forged through crisis that tested everything, sustained by loyalty proven through blood and survival. And no force in the world could take it from them, because they'd already survived the worst, already faced destruction and emerged stronger, already proven that partnership absolute enough to die for was strong enough to live for. The northern territories belonged to Draven rule, not through fear, through choice, through results, through loyalty that ran both directions and partnership that actually meant something. Seraphine and Vaelor would protect it, would maintain it, would build it into something that endured not just through their lifetimes, but beyond. Legacy not of terror, but of commitment. Empire not of domination, but of protection. Power not of possession, but of partnership. They'd survived. They'd rebuilt. They'd transformed ruthless empire into something that could actually sustain itself through loyalty instead of just fear. And that was worth everything it had cost. Every sacrifice, every scar, every moment of crisis that had tested whether they were strong enough to become what Blackthorne needed. They were. Together, they were strong enough for anything. The sun disappeared below mountains. Darkness claimed valleys. But Blackthorne Keep burned with light, fires in every window, torches along every wall, empire refusing to submit to darkness because two rulers stood watch, who'd been tested beyond destruction and emerged unbroken. This was their legacy, their empire, their choice made absolute, and it would stand as long as they stood together. Partners, equals, rulers who'd learned that real strength included protecting what you claimed to rule. Blackthorne endured. The ruthless Duke and loyal lady ensured it, forever.